Let's go over the tools that you'll need to have on your computer to complete this project. First, you'll need to have installed Node.js. You can get that at nodejs.org, and there you'll find options to download the stable version of Node, which is currently 8.12, or the most recent version, 10.10. I'd recommend going with the stable version, and it's the version that Node recommends as well. We'll be using Firebase for our backend, for our database, for our storage in this application. So you'll need to create an account with Firebase at firebase.google.com, and you can either do that now or you can do it in the relevant section where we set up Firebase. It's up to you. And the code editor I'll be using, which is optional of course, is Visual Studio Code, and you can grab that for free at code.visualstudio.com. There you'll find options for Mac, Windows, or Linux computers. Throughout the course of creating our app, we're going to be working with a couple of browser extensions that will make doing things like debugging and looking at state and props a lot easier. And these are the React and Redux dev tools. They're available to anyone using either Chrome or Firefox browsers. And right now I'm going to show you how to install both of these extensions if you're using Chrome. And this will work for Chrome Canary as well if you're using the developer version of Chrome like I am. So first, when you have Chrome open, you'll head to the top to this Windows panel and head down to the extensions option. This will take you to the extensions page at chrome//extensions. You'll see all the extensions that you currently have installed, and just to note, you can remove these in the future. So if you ever want to remove what we're installing right now, you can just click on the remove button back in this page. You'll click on the hamburger icon in the top left hand corner, and in the side panel that opens at the very bottom you'll click on Open Chrome Web Store. So here in the top left hand corner we'll want to search for first React Dev Tools or React Developer Tools, and the first option that comes up should be the one that we want. We'll then click on Add to Chrome. It'll confirm that we want to add the extension. We'll click on Add Extension, and we should see this confirmation window pop up that it's been added to Chrome. And now all we need to do is search for Redux Dev Tools and do the same. Again, it should be the first option that pops up. Click on Add Extension, and in a second, hopefully, that should be added as well. And all you'll need to do in the future to open these developer tools when we have our React development server up and running is right click, hit inspect to open our console, and then we'll click on the forward arrow. We'll see here when we're actually working with a React app a React option to open the dev tools, and the same will apply to Redux. Just drag that into my code editor to load all the files within it. And once you've done that, we will then install all of the dependencies listed within the package.json file by running npm install, or you can just use the shortcut npm I. And upon running this, we'll have a node modules folder that contains all of our dependencies, and we'll be able to start up and begin building our React application. We've installed all the dependencies for our project. Now we can clear out the logging in our terminal and remove any Git files we might have brought down when we cloned this repo with rm-rf.get. This will remove any Git files in our project. We don't want to use someone else's version control, but if you want to initialize Git, you can just run git init, set up file tracking, then we'll run npm start to start up our development server. That should start up at localhost 3000 and show the homepage, the styles for the homepage of Create React App. So we used Create React App to bootstrap all these starting project files, and we'll go into the source folder, into app.js, and remove all the markup within the div tags. We'll replace that with the text of app, we'll remove the class name of app, and remove the logo import up at the top, and delete the logo.svg file within the source folder as well. We want to remove any initial styles, so go to app.css, clear out all the style rules there. We're going to create a new folder in the source folder for all of our components. So this will be called components, and we'll drag in app.js and app.css into this newly created folder. Then, since we changed the path of app, going to, within index.js, change the app path to /components/app, save all of our files, and we should see on the home page just the text of app in the top left hand corner. Now let's set up some routing for our application. We'll import a few things from the package React Router DOM. We'll first grab browser router and rename it as router, as well as the switch and route components for our individual routes. We'll house all of our routes within a stateless functional component called route. All of our individual routes will be within a switch component that's within the router component. Our first route will be the root route, so we'll give it a path of just / and connect it to the component app. Now we want to render root instead of app, since app is now a route. We'll save that, and we should still see app, the app text on our home page. We're going to create a new folder within our components folder called auth. We're going to add the files for the components login and register to that auth folder. And within register, we'll import React up at the top. This will be a stateful component. So we'll say class register extends react.component. We'll have its necessary render function as well as the return. For now, we'll just return a div with the text of register and export at the bottom with export default the register component. Grab all the markup that we just wrote and paste it within login. We'll change the class to login, the text to login, and the export to the login component. Then we'll create routes for both of these new components within our index file. We'll create a route with the path of login that'll reference the login component, and a path of register with a component of register. And we'll bring in both of those components into index.js. We'll import login from components auth login. You can copy that and change the path to /register at the end and the name to register. And we want to add the exact keyword on the root path to make sure that we're not matching multiple components, which is what the switch component will do if we don't have that exact keyword there. Then we can, within our browser, go to login and the register routes. We're going to be using Firebase as the backend and database to our project. Now, Firebase is a great choice for us since we're making a chat app where we want users to be able to see new messages in real time. And Firebase is what's known as a real-time database. It makes use of a technology called WebSockets in order to make data transfer very fast. So we'll create an account with Firebase at firebase.google.com, and we'll click on, once you've signed up, go to console. We'll be taken to console.firebase.google.com. We want to add a project by clicking on add project. Include our project name. I'll give mine the name of React/clone. Then we'll be asked to agree to their terms. So click the checkbox, then click on create project. Firebase will now create our project. Once our project is ready, we'll click on the continue button, and we'll be taken to a kind of admin panel for our project. We'll begin by, underneath the line get started by adding Firebase to your app, we'll click on this code icon. It'll give us some instructions and data we'll use to integrate Firebase with our web app. Underneath the initialize Firebase comment, we want to grab both the config object as well as the function called firebase.initializeApp, which takes that config object. We'll copy all of that, head back to our app. We're going to add a new file within our source folder for all of this. that we copied. We're going to call this firebase.js. We'll paste that right in. And since we're making use of Firebase here when we're calling initialize app with all of the configuration data, we're going to import Firebase from firebase/app, and we're going to import a few other packages as well, say sub dependencies I should say. We'll import firebase/auth for authorization within our app, Firebase/database to make use of the real-time database, Firebase/storage, which will allow us to store things like media files, at the very bottom we'll export Firebase with export default to make that available to other parts of our app. Then if you'll notice, the storage bucket property just has an empty string. We want to set up our Firebase storage. So we'll go over to the storage tab on the left hand side, and in that page we'll click on Get Started. It will show us some default security rules for our storage. Just say got it. And from here we want to grab the URL up at the top after the gs // that URL that ends with appspot.com, and paste that directly into our storage bucket property to set up Firebase storage. Now we can save that file and start making use of Firebase within our React app. We'll be using the component library Semantic UI React for our markup and styles within our project. You can find the documentation for it at reactsemanticui.com. We'll be using their usage section in order to finish setting it up. We've already installed the Semantic UI React dependency. Now we just need to bring in the related styles. So we'll grab this import to the Semantic UI style sheet. You can either copy as you see it here or go to their documentation to grab it. And we'll import it within index.js, and we'll remove the import to index.css and remove the file entirely from our project files. And once we save index.js, we should see the rules from that style sheet applied to our app. You can see that the text is a bit different, a bit smaller. And now we'll use Semantic UI React in order to build out our register component. We'll import a number of components from Semantic UI React. In particular, we'll grab the grid, form, segment, button, header, message, and icon components. And we'll begin with the grid component as the parent component. Grid will be used to structure content within our components. We'll give it the prop text align center and vertical align middle to center everything on the X and Y axes. We'll give it a grid column component to put everything within a column in our grid. We'll give it a style prop with a rule of max width set to 450. So the max width of this column will be 450 pixels. We'll have our header component, which we'll set as an H2, as H2 tags. Give it a prop of icon, a color of orange, text align set to center again to center all the text within it. We're going to include an icon within the header, and the name for it will be puzzle piece. You can find all the available icons within the documentation to Semantic UI. We'll give it a color of orange, and the text will be register for dev chat. So dev chat will be the name of our app. Underneath the header we'll have a form component with the size of large, so we can set the size for a number of these Semantic UI components. And we'll include a segment so we can put together all of the related content, and a prop of stack to stack everything on top of one another. And within this form we'll have a number of inputs. So we'll have a form input with the prop of fluid to make the input the entire width of the parent component, the name of username, icon of user. We'll position the icon to the left and give it a placeholder text of username. And as with any input, we need to add an onChange handler, so we'll set that to the function handleChange, which we'll eventually use to update state according to the value typed into this input. but for now we'll just leave that empty, as well as an empty state object. We'll also give it a type of text to indicate that we're just going to be typing text for this username input. We can copy that entire input component, paste it in right underneath. We'll change the name to email, the icon that'll have to mail, the placeholder to email address, so this is where users will type in their email address to register, and the type of it will be email. We'll set up some really basic HTML5 validation. We'll paste it in again, give it a name of password, an icon of block, a placeholder of password, and the type for it will be password. Now we'll copy this password input and paste it underneath, and this will be the password confirmation input for users to be able to confirm the password that they supplied. Give it a name of password confirmation, an icon of repeat, placeholder of password confirmation, 2 words, and we'll leave the type as password. Then we'll have a button that users can click on to submit their form. Give it a color of orange, it'll be fluid, and the size will be large. Underneath the form we'll have a message which will tell users or ask them if they're already a user. And we'll import the link component from the package React Router DOM. So if they're already a user, if they've already registered before, we'll give them a link so they can log in, go to the login page. So the link will be to /login and the text will be login. You can save all of that. If we take a look in our browser, you can see our register form. Although it's kind of up at the top, we need to bring this down to the middle of the page. We'll do that by going to app.css and adding a rule for HTML body and this app class that we'll create. We'll give it a height of 100 view height, so it'll take up the entire height of the browser. We'll give it a background, the hex code EEE, and the padding of 1em around it. And we'll provide that class name that we just created, the rule that we just created, to our grid component, the class name of app. If we refresh, we can see the background's changed, our form is centered, and if we click on the login link, let's add functionality to our register form so our user can fill it out and register for our app. We'll begin with the handle change function, which we attach to every input via the onChange handler. We're going to pass through the event object, and using the data on this object, whenever there's a change event, we're going to set the state. And we want to set properties within state that correspond to these name attributes that we set for each of the inputs. So to get the name of a given input that a user is typing in, we'll do it with event.target.name, and the value that the user has typed into a given input we'll access with event.target.value. And within state we want properties that correspond to each of the values that we set to the name property. So it'll be username, email, password, and password confirmation. We'll set those all to an empty string, and back in our app we can right click and hit inspect to open our console. You can alternatively hit Option, Command, and J or I. We'll hit the arrow up at the top and go to our React DevTools. We'll then search for our register component. Now we can see the state object with all the properties that we put in there. If we type into each one of these inputs, we should see the corresponding property in state updated. Now we want to make it so a user can hit submit when they filled out all the fields and actually register themselves. We'll first touch on an optional step that we can perform. We can destructure all of the values from the state object and pass them down to our individual inputs. We'll grab the username, email, password, and password confirmation from state using object destructuring, and we'll pass each of those to their respective input via the value prop. The purpose of doing this, of passing the value of a given input back to its input component, is that when we set the state, for example, if we set the state of each one of these properties to say an empty string, we can clear any of the values that a user has typed in to their form. So it allows us to clear our form. And on the form component, we're going to add an onSubmit handler, and we're going to connect it to the handle submit function that we're going to create right underneath handle change. It'll also take the event, and we're going to call a method on the event that we're getting called prevent default to prevent the default action of sending a form, which is to reload the page. And now we want to import Firebase from our Firebase file. It includes all of our configuration and the imported packages, the subdependencies. And in particular, we're going to want to grab and use the Firebase/auth dependency. So we're going to get Firebase from 2 levels up. So now we can use it within handle submit. We're going to first call the auth method to make use of all the authorization tools, and then we're going to call create user with email and password. And to this, all we need to do to register a user is to pass in the value that a user supplied for the email input and the password input from state, this.state.email and this.state.password. And since this is a promise, we can, within a then statement, we can get back the user that's created by Firebase. And for now, we'll just log that as created user. And after the then, we'll catch any errors with this catch statement. We'll pass through any errors to a simple console.error. So we'll save that, head to our console from our dev tools, and we'll sign up or register with a user, provide a username, email, password, and password confirmation. And when we hit submit, we see in the console that we're getting an error. We're getting a 400 error, and in particular we're getting a message that tells us that the given sign-in provider is disabled and that we need to enable it within the Firebase console. So we're trying to sign in using the sign-in provider. To enable it, we need to go to the Authentication tab within our Firebase console and click on this button, Set Up Sign-In Method. And up here, next to the email and password provider, we click on the pencil icon and we'll hit Enable for this to enable signups with email and password. Now we can see the status for it is enabled. We can head back to our app and try submitting this form one more time to register our first user. And it looks like it's successful. We get an object back with a number of properties, additional user info, credential, operation type. All of the user info that we provided will be within this user property. It includes a bunch of other stuff as well. So it includes the email that we provided to it, as well as stuff like phone number, photo URL, refresh token, a number of things. We'll be making use of a number of these properties in later sections and updating them for a given user. And if we take a look at back in Firebase in our admin panel, the users tab, we can see we have our first user here in this user table with the identifier, the provider, when it was created, when the user signed in, and their user ID. If we don't fill in any of the inputs in our register form, but still hit the submit button, in our console we get an error from Firebase, and we shouldn't allow this to happen. We shouldn't be able to send the form data to our backend without first making sure that all of the fields are filled out. So we'll add some form validation within handle submit by adding a conditional where we call the function isFormValid. And only if the form is valid will we allow the data to be sent off to Firebase from the form. So we'll create this isFormValid function, and it'll check for a couple of things. First, we'll execute a function called isFormEmpty to make sure all of our inputs are filled out. If not, we'll throw an error. Otherwise, we'll check to make sure our passwords are valid. And if that's not the case, we'll throw an error in that event too. But if both of these conditions are met, we'll say that our form is valid and return true, allowing our form data to be sent off to Firebase. We'll first create this isFormEmpty function, And within isFormEmpty, which we'll create underneath isFormValid, we want to take each of the input values that are stored within our state object. So we can pass in where we call isFormEmpty the entire state object, and then within the parameters, destructure using object destructuring each of the individual values for our inputs, and check to make sure that there is a value provided to each of them. And we'll do that with a conditional where it'll take the length of the value that was typed in and turn it into its opposite Boolean value. So if we have a length of 0 for any one of these inputs, we'll return from this function true, indicating that our form is not entirely filled out. And to throw an error when we return true from our isFormEmpty function, within isFormValid we'll create a variable called errors set equal to an empty array and an error variable. So we'll assign our error variable to an object with a property of message with the text fill in all fields. And we want to set the state to put that error on an errors array within state. So we'll add that property to our state object, and we'll update that by taking the errors, the empty errors array, and concatenating the error object that we just created. And then we want to return false, indicating that we should not execute handle submit. Then let's create a function that'll check to see if our passwords are valid. So we'll also pass the state object to isPasswordValid, but instead of destructuring all of the values, all of the input values, we'll just grab password and password confirmation. And here we first want to check the length of both of these values. If either password or password confirmation have a length of less than 6, we're going to return false, indicating that our passwords aren't valid. So the passwords that we provide to the form need to be at least 6 characters in length. We also want to check to make sure that our password and password confirmation values are the same. Otherwise, we'll return true if both of those conditions are met. And then to cover the error case, if our password isn't valid, we'll assign the error variable to an object, the property of message, and the text of password is invalid, and once again set the state where we set the errors array in state and concatenate error onto our errors array, and return false at the end of that as well. Now we can save our changes and test this out, test out our validation. If we hit submit, you don't see any Firebase error in the console anymore. We'll head to our React DevTools and navigate to our register component, pull up the state. In our errors array, we see that we have one new element. It's an object with the message of fill in all fields. And now if we fill in the entire form, but our password confirmation doesn't match our password, we get the error message, password is invalid. And also if our passwords match, but they're both too short, we get the same error message. If we don't fill out all the fields, we get fill in all fields again. So it looks like our form validation is working well. Finally, we want to display any errors from our form validation to our user so they know what's going wrong in sending off the form. We'll create a function called display errors to do that. It'll take the errors array that we have in state. We'll use the map method to map over those errors, where we'll take the error value as well as the index of the element that we're iterating over and return a set of p tags. We'll put the key prop on the opening tag set equal to the index, and we'll show them the message with the interpolated value error.message. So underneath our form component, we're going to display any errors, first by checking to see that we have some errors within our errors array, to make sure that the length of the errors array is greater than 0. If that's the case, we're going to show our user a message component with this error prop to give it some error styling. Within it there'll be an h3 with the text of error. Then we'll call our display errors function underneath, where we'll pass in the errors array from state. Now if we destructure errors from state within our render, we can make the path to this a bit shorter. We can just check to see that errors.length is greater than 0 and pass in errors to display errors. We'll save that, head back to our app. If we hit submit, we can see our error message underneath telling us to fill in all the fields. And if we fill in our form such that our password and password confirmations don't match, we'll also get our password error. We've improved our register form by adding error handling and form validation, but there's a couple of small errors to take note of. When we try to register with a new user, it's possible to hit submit twice. And as a result, our user's registered, but we get an error, and we're also not clearing any errors when we have a successful registration. To fix both of these errors, we'll head back up to Handle Submit, where we'll first move event.prevent default above the isFormValid conditional. And before we reach out to Firebase, we're going to set the state. We're going to clear the errors array, and we're going to set a loading property to true. Now we haven't created this loading property yet, so we'll do that within our state object. Loading will initially be set to false, and we'll set it to true only when we're in the process of registering a user. And when we hit the then part of our promise, we're going to set loading back to false, and if we have any errors in the catch part, we'll set loading to false there as well, since our promise has resolved, although unsuccessfully. And here we can also set our errors object, our errors array, and concatenate the error that we're getting onto it. Now we'll destructure our loading property from state within render and head down to our submit button. We first want to set the class of the button according to the loading value. So we'll give the class name value a ternary, where it'll check to see if loading set to true. If so, we'll give it class of loading, which will put a loading spinner within the button. And we'll also give it the disabled prop, where if loading is true, our button will be disabled, and the user in the process of being registered won't be able to click on the submit button twice. Now if we head back to our form and we have an error, for example, our password is invalid, if we fill this out correctly and hit submit again, we can see that our error is cleared, our button is disabled, and we see our loading spinner, and now we see our new user information. And of course, if we hit submit again, we get our error from Firebase, but now that error is put within our error message too. Additionally, if an error is coming from incorrectly filling out a given input, we can give that input an error class, some error styling. We'll do that in the class name prop, where we'll iterate over all the errors using the SumArray method, and for each error element, we'll take the message property of the error object and convert the text to lowercase just to normalize it, and we'll see using the includes method whether the text for the error includes the name of the input. So in this case, to see if it includes the text email. If so, we'll give it an error class. Otherwise, we won't give it any class. This provides a nice visual indication for our user about where the error is coming from, what they need to change. So if we try to register a new user but supply an email address that's associated with an already registered user, we'll get an error about it. Now we can see visually our email input's red, indicating that something is wrong with it. And we can apply this to our other inputs as well. But in order to make this a bit easier, we'll create this handle input error function. And this function will take a couple of things. First, the errors array, and then the input name, the name of the input that we're on. So we can grab all of the code, they had to determine the class name for our email input, and just replace that with a call to handle input error, where we pass down the errors array and the name of the input, email, as a string. So now we can paste all that we copied within handle input error and make sure that we return the class based on the value that it computes. And instead of checking to see whether this error message includes just email, we'll pass in the input name parameter to it. So now we can call this function for the class names of both password and password confirmation, and we'll give both of them an input name of password. We could also do the same for username if you like, if you're creating any username specific errors. So to test this out, we'll try registering a new user, but whose password and password confirmation values aren't the same. And we hit submit, and we see our password is invalid and both of our password inputs are highlighted red to indicate an error with them. When we register new users, we know that we get back some automatically created user data from Firebase. For the purposes of our app, we want to change some of these values. So if we register a new user and take a look at that user object, we see first that display name is set to null. We want to use display name to store the user's username in our app. Also, photo URL is set to null. This is where we want to store the user's avatar image. So back in the then statement where we're registering our user, we'll comment out set state and take the created user object, and on the user property we have this update profile method, which we'll use to give display name the value of the username input and pass a URL to photo URL, where we'll get an avatar from gravatar.com/avatar, and then we will import a function called MD5 from the package MD5. Now MD5 is usually used to hash messages. We'll be using it to create a unique value to provide to the gravatar.com/avatar URL, and we'll take the user email from createdUser.user.email, since it's a unique value as required by Firebase, pass it to MD5. Then after we interpolate this value, we'll add $D equals identicon to get a avatar image generated for each new user. We'll add a then statement after that, and within the then we'll set state and our loading property to false, and after that we'll catch any errors in a catch block, as well as set those errors in state by concatenating onto the errors array the error that we're getting, as well as set loading to false there. We'll save all that, and we'll head back to our app, and we'll try registering a new user. And we'll take a look at the user data that comes back from Firebase. As we can see, we have display name set to the username value that we provided, and in photo URL we should have an avatar image with our gravatar.com URL. If we save this object as a global variable in our console, and then we access the photo URL path, if we copy that link and open it in a new tab, should be able to see our avatar image that was generated by Gravatar. And now that we're adding a username and avatar to the user that's just been registered, within the then statement where we're setting the loading property of state to false, we're going to instead call a function saveUser, where we pass in the created user and add a then block where in the body we're just going to log user saved. So as the then indicates, this will be a promise, And underneath handle submit, we'll create a save user function where it'll take created user. And we want save user to save the users that we're registering to our database. So back in our Firebase console, we'll click on the database tab on the left-hand side, and we'll scroll down to where we have the option for real-time database, and we'll click on create database. We want to start in test mode to allow all reads and writes for the time being, and then click on enable to set up our Firebase database. So we can click on this plus button, and we can take a look at what this collection will look like for our users. We'll have an array of users for every new user that registers. We'll have a unique ID for them, and on that ID we're going to include information about the user that just registered, their display name value, their name that they provided, as well as their photo URL, which will be gravatar.com/something. And so it'll look something like this, where we'll have a users collection, an array of users with their unique IDs, and within them their specific information. But we'll delete that sample collection and go back to our code editor to actually implement that. So within save user, we're going to return a users ref. We're first going to need to create a users ref property in state, which is going to reference the collection that we just took a look at. It'll be at the path firebase.database.ref with the string of users. So this will reference that collection of data where all of our users will be added. And we can put a child piece of data on it with the child method. And we want to put their ID, and we'll get that with createdUser.user.uid. If you're interested at taking a look at what that is, when we get our user information back upon registering, we have this unique UID value at the very bottom of the user object. So that's what we're going to be setting as a child in our users collection in our database, and we're going to use the set method to set an object on that unique ID for our user, and we'll have a name property which will reference the username at createdUser.user.displayName, and an avatar property, createdUser.user.photoURL, the two things that we just set on our user data object. So we'll save that. We'll try registering another user. We'll hit submit. We can see our user data created by Firebase, our user saved log that we provided to the then statement after executing our save user function and updating the profile of the created user. So if we head back to our database, we see this new users collection with a unique ID for the newly created user as a child and the user's avatar and name within it. If we take a look at our login component by clicking on the login link, we can see that it's not been built out at all. So we'll move on to creating that. But first I want to go to the header component within register and change that to as H1 instead of H2, just to make the header a bit bigger for appearance's sake. We'll copy all of the markup within the register component, and then login, we'll select everything and paste in what we copied from register. We'll change all of our code as needed. We'll remove the import from MD5. We'll change the name of the class from register to login. We'll remove the properties username, password confirmation, and users ref from state. We'll get rid of the validation functions. We'll get rid of isFormValid, as well as isFormEmpty and isPasswordValid. We'll remove the Firebase promise where we're calling create user with email and password within our handle submit. We'll get rid of the call to save user, so the save user function, and we'll remove the destructured values for user and password confirmation in render. And now we'll change the header to the color violet, change the name of the icon within the header to code branch, color of that to violet, and the text within the header to login to DevChat. I'm going to get rid of the username input as well as the password confirmation input. Change the button to violet. We're going to change the message at the bottom to include the text "don't have an account?" ? And link them to the register route with the text of register. And at the end, make sure to export the login component. If we save all that, we go to login, you can see our new form here. The first thing we'll do within login is we'll change the call to isFormValid to pass in this.state and create a new isFormValid function. We're going to destructure the email and password properties, and within the return we're just going to check to make sure that there are values for email and password by using the AND conditional, and underneath the set state in handle submit, going to once again use the auth function in Firebase and then call sign in with email and password, which will take the email value and password values in state. We'll have our then block, which will give us the signed in user data from the user that just signed in, so we'll log that. And we'll make sure to catch any errors in our catch block. We'll log it with console.error, and we'll set the state. In particular, we'll set the errors property on state and concatenate the error message onto our errors array and set loading to false. We'll save that, head back, and see if we can log in with a user that we've already registered with. Type in their email, their password. If we pass in an incorrect password, you can see we're still getting our error message. But if we type in the correct password, we see our user information within the console. Users can now log in or register within our app, and once they do, we can see their user data in the console, we can see the loading state, but now we want to take them somewhere once they're authenticated, in particular to the app component, which is where our chat will live. To implement this, we'll go to index.js and we'll bring in Firebase. We're going to be using a listener from Firebase, which will be able to detect whether a user has recently logged in or registered within our app, and we'll change the root component to a stateful component. So we'll change const to class, so class root will extend react.component. We'll have a render function, and we'll bring in everything that we previously returned, all of the routes. We'll bring that within our render function and just pop the return keyword in front of that. And as I mentioned, we're going to execute a listener. We'll do that when this root component mounts. We'll use the component did mount lifecycle method for this. So when our root component mounts, we're going to run firebase.auth.onAuthStateChange. This is a listener which is going to detect whether we have a user in our app, and we'll set up a conditional. Say if we have a user, if Firebase has detected a user, we're going to want to redirect them to our home route. We'll do that with React Router DOM using the history object, this.props.history.push to the root route. If we save that, you can see in our console we're getting this error, cannot read property push of undefined. So we're trying to make use of the history object to redirect outside of our routes. We'll first need the higher order component with router from React Router DOM to put the history object within our root component. So we'll create a new variable called root with auth, and we'll wrap root with the with router higher order component. We'll also grab the router tags and we'll wrap this new component that we just created within render with router. So we can only redirect when we're within a router, and we'll change the route that we're rendering to now route with auth to include the with router HOC. So now we can redirect once we have a user. Now if we go back to our page, we can see we're currently on the app component. If we go back to login, we can try to visit login, but we'll immediately be taken back to app since we're now logged in. And if we go to register, that listener will do the same. It will just redirect us. Now that we've got the unauth state changed listener set up, if we're authenticated, we're always redirected back to the app component, which is where our chat will live. If we log this user value that we have access to within unauth state changed, when we take a look at our console, we can see that it's an object which includes all of our user information for our currently authenticated user. And in developing the chat portion of our app, we're going to be creating a lot of components, many of which are going to need to access this user data. It'd be nice if we could execute a function with the name, for example, of setUser, where we pass in the user data and put all of that data on global state so any of our React components that want to make use of it can. To do this, we'll set up the state management system Redux within index.js, and we'll import a few packages to set that up. We'll import the function createStore from Redux. We'll import the provider component from React Redux, as well as the function composeWithDevTools in order to set up our Redux DevTools extension. Now, to create our global state, all we need to do is create a store variable, and this will store the return value from executing the createStore function, and to that we just need to pass an empty function for now, as well as composeWithDevTools and make sure to execute that function. To provide this global state, this global store to all of our components, we'll use the provider component. We'll wrap our router with it. Provider will provide our global state to any component that wants to use it, and we'll pass that down using the store prop. We'll pass the store variable to it. Now that we've set that up, if we take a look at our browser, we can see our DevTools icon for Redux is now glowing green. If we go to the Redux DevTools extension within our console, you can see this interface which we'll use in order to interact with our global state. And currently it's empty because we haven't set up our state, any of the properties on state, or any of the actions that we'll be using to interact with state. But we'll begin by creating an actions folder within our source folder. And this will contain two files, an index.js file as well as a types file. And action types will be responsible for determining what type of change we want to make to our global state. So within our types file, we'll create our first type. This will be a variable called setUser equal to the string of the same name, setUser. We'll put this as a variable and export it since we're going to be using it in a number of files. And the first place we'll use it is in this index.js file that we created in our actions folder. We'll import all of the exports, all of the exported types from our types file as an object called action types. Then we'll create our first action, which will have the same name, setUser, but written in a camel case syntax. And to this function, we'll pass in the user data that we'll be getting. And from our action, we want to return two things. First of all, the type. And the type we'll return is the type that we just created, the setUser type on our action types object, and then a payload. So actions will also be responsible for passing the data that our state needs to be changed with. So on our payload object, we'll have one property of current user set to the user data that's passed into it. Now, in order to actually perform the change to state of setting the user, we're going to create functions called reducers, and we'll do that within this reducers folder and create just an index.js file within it. Here we'll also need to import our action types from our actions folder in the types file. And the first reducer function that we'll create will be called user reducer, because it will reduce all of the user related data. It'll take a state argument as well as the action that's coming in, and within the body we'll set up a switch statement where it will update state accordingly depending upon the type of action that's coming in, as we set with that type variable. So in the case that this is a set user action, the type of set user, we're going to want to update state where we first take the current user data that's coming from action.payload.currentUser, the user data that we put on the current user property in our set user action, and we also want to set the property isLoading to false, which we'll create on our state. And we also need to set up a default case in every reducer where if it doesn't match a given action type, all it's going to do is just return the state as it was. And to this state parameter, we're going to set a default value of initial user state. So this is what our user state will look like without any changes. So we'll create this as an object just above our reducer, where current user will be set to null and isLoading will be set to true by default. Now we want our reducer functions to only operate on a certain part of state. For example, our user reducer should only modify our user property on the global state. So we'll create this variable called root_reducer, and it will use a function which will import from Redux called combine reducers, and combine reducers will allow us to determine what property on global state a given reducer updates. So we'll include combine reducers, and within the object that it takes, we can determine that user reducer will be updating and put its state values on this user property. And now once we have that, we can export default this root reducer variable, and we'll replace our empty function within create store with root reducer to get our entire state object. And we'll make sure to import root reducer from the reducers folder. We'll save all of our files, and if we refresh our app, we take a look at our Redux DevTools and click on the state option, you can see we have this one property of user, and on that property, current user property as well as isLoading. So we successfully set up our first action, action type, and reducer. In order to set our user data on global state with the set user action, we'll need the connect function from React Redux. And as the name implies, connect will allow us to connect our Redux state and actions with a given React component. So we'll wrap root with connect to execute it, and in a set of parentheses before wrapping root, we'll have access to first the global state with the map state to props argument, but we don't need any state, so we'll just pass in null. And then we have this map dispatch to props argument as the second argument. And this is where we'll get our actions. And all we need to do to get set user is to destructure it from the map dispatch to props object. So we'll destructure set user, and we'll import set user from the index file of the actions folder. And what connect and map dispatch to props will do is it will take this set user action and put it on our props object of the component that we're wrapping with connect. So now set user will be on this .props. So if we save our index file, when our page reloads, we'll execute the set user action, and our current user property on the user object is updated to the value that we're getting from our on-off state changed listener. Now that we've created the set user action as well as our global state, when we're authenticated and then redirected from login to our app component, our user data is put on our global state. But since state updates are asynchronous and take a certain amount of time to resolve, we'll pass the mapState2props function as the first argument to our connect function to get loading data from our state object to see when the setUserAction is still being loaded. We want to get the loading property, and this will be located on our user property of state. So the path of that will be state.user.isLoading. And within mapState2props, and mind the typo, it should be mapState2props, we're going to return an object which will have a property name of isLoading and our path of state.user.isLoading to get the current value of that. We can log the isLoading property as the name of the function suggests on our props object. So we can do that with this.props.isLoading. We can see the current value of isLoading when our root component is being mounted. You can see within our console when the component's mounted, it is true. So in order to prevent our user from seeing a blank screen as this setUserAction is being executed, we're going to set up a ternary in our return statement. We're going to check to see if this.props.isLoading is true, and if it is, if it's still loading, we're going to show a spinner component. Otherwise, we're going to show our app route, our app component. So we'll create a spinner component within our source folder, call it spinner.js. We'll import React up at the top, and to create this spinner, we'll use the loader component from Semantic UI React. This will be a stateless functional component with the same name of spinner, and we'll immediately return the loader component. We'll make sure to export it at the bottom. And we can set a number of props on this loader component. First of all, we can set the size. We'll set that to huge. And we can provide some text underneath it with the content prop. We'll provide the text of preparing chat to tell our users exactly what's taking place. Then we'll import within index.js spinner from /spinner. And save both of those files. If we head back to our app, we don't see anything. So it looks like our spinner wasn't working, but in fact it was working. We were displaying it to our users while the action was being resolved. You just couldn't see it. So to make it visible, we'll bring in the dimmer component to surround the loader component, and this will provide a dark background to our loader. We'll give it the prop of active. So now when we reload the page, we can see our loader and our text of preparing chat as our setUserAction is being resolved. Let's build out the basic structure for our app component. We'll go to app.js and remove the app class as well as the component import from React. We'll change app to a stateless functional component, and it'll have one component from Semantic UI React, the grid component. So include a set of grid tags, and within the grid we'll have a number of custom components. We'll have a color panel component, a side panel component, a messages component, and finally a meta panel component. We'll create a folder for our color panel, which will include a color panel component. Up at the top, we'll import React. This will be a stateful component, so it will be class color panel extends react.component. We'll have our render and return. For now, we'll just return a div, the text of color panel, and then export it. You can copy all this markup, and we'll create our next folder within the components folder, side panel, with its corresponding component side panel. We'll paste all that in, all the markup we copied, change the class to side panel, the text to side panel, and the export to side panel. And we'll do the same for our messages component. We'll include file of messages, paste in our markup, and change the class name, the text, and the export. We'll have one final folder, meta panel, with a component of the same name. Paste in the markup. So will be class meta panel, div the text of meta panel, and export the component. Within app, we'll import each of these components within their respective folders. Color panel from color panel, side panel from side panel slash side panel, messages from messages slash messages, meta panel from meta panel slash meta panel. You can save all those files, take a look at our app component. You can see the components are lined up next to one another. Now we'll use grid to organize the components a bit better. We'll set the columns prop to equal, class name will be app, and we'll give it a style prop with the background rule set to the hex code EEE. Now we'll leave the color panel and side panel off to the side. They won't have their own column, but we'll wrap messages and meta panel in a set of grid column tags. For messages, we want to offset it from color panel and side panel by giving it a style prop, and that'll include a rule where margin left will be set to 320 pixels. And we'll do the same with meta panel. We'll wrap it in grid column tags, and we'll give it a width of 4. Now since Semantic UI uses a 16-point grid system, this means that the meta panel column will take up a width of a fourth of the page width. If we save that file, we take a look at our app, you can see the basic structure that each of our components within our chat will have. Within our app component, we'll begin with our side panel. And the first thing we'll add to it is a user panel where we'll be able to log out of the app. Within side panel, we'll replace the starting div with a menu component from Semantic UI React. And the menu will contain a number of custom components, but first we'll add a number of props to it, give it a size of large, give it the inverted prop to make the text that we'll have within the menu light in color. We'll make it fixed to the left-hand side of our app component. It'll be a vertical menu, and we'll give it a style prop where the background will be set to the hex code 4C, 3C, 4C. And we'll give it a slightly larger than usual font size of 1.2 rems. If we save that, take a look at our menu here on the left-hand side of the app. As I mentioned, we're going to add some custom components within it, within the menu tags. The first will be the user panel. So we'll create the user panel component within our side panel folder. We'll import React. This will be a class-based component, a stateful component. We'll have our render and our return. And we'll start out with a component of grid from Semantic UI React. On it, we'll set the style tag, make its background the same with the hex code 4C, 3C, 4C. And within our grid tags, we'll have a column where we'll have a grid row. So we can have a number of rows within each column. And on it, we'll set the style. In particular, it's padding to 1.2 ems and a margin of 0. And within the row tags, we'll include a header. So make sure to import that from Semantic UI React. I'll just add a comment above the header saying this is our main application header. Within the header we can have this set of content tags to specify the text content. We'll make this dev chat. We'll give our header an inverted prop. We'll float it to the left and we'll make it an H2. And within our header we'll include an icon, so we'll import that. And it'll have the name code. If we save that, and make sure to export it at the bottom, export user panel, and then import it within side panel. If we save once again, you can see our dev chat header up at the top with our code icon. But on top of having a header within our grid column, underneath the row we'll have a user dropdown where a user can select a number of options, and for now we want to include the option of being able to log out of our app. And before the closing tag for our grid column, we'll add another header with a style and its padding set to 0.25 ems, and this will be as an H4 and inverted once again. And we'll put the dropdown component within the header. We'll bring in dropdown component. We'll set the trigger for the dropdown, what will trigger opening the options within the dropdown, and an options prop which will display all of the available options for our user. So the trigger will be a span with the text of user, and the options will be a function which will execute as drop-down options. So we'll create drop-down options as a function on our user panel, and we'll immediately return from that an array. And this array will have a number of objects within it. There'll be a text property on each object. For the first one, we'll just have a span where it tells us that we're signed in as a certain user. And this first option will be disabled since it won't be something that we can click on. We're just telling our user that they're currently signed in. The next object will have text property with the span set to change avatar. Now our user will be able to click on this soon enough to be able to change their avatar. And then we'll have an option for a user to sign out. And we need to provide key properties to each of these objects. So we'll just give them different names. For example, the first object will have a key of user, next we'll have a key of avatar, and the last will have a key of sign out. We'll save that. We can take a look at our dropdown. We can click on it. We can see our options for change avatar and sign out. In the last section, we created our user panel component, which includes a dropdown where we have this sign out option. Now we want to add the functionality to that, so when we click on it, we're redirected to the login page and our user is signed out. So within the option for sign out within our dropdown, I'm going to add an onClick to the span and reference a function called handle sign out. And to sign out our user, we're going to need Firebase. So we'll import Firebase up at the top, and it should be from 2 folders up. We'll use the auth module again, and we'll use a method on it called signout. So we'll execute that. We can add on a then statement where once we sign out using Firebase, we can log the text signed out. If we save that and open our log, we select sign out. When we're authenticated, we see our signed out log in the console. And if we try redirecting or going manually to our login route, we're just going to see this loading spinner. Now that's because we didn't set up a case within our onAuthStateChanged function within index.js for when our user is not found by the listener. So in this else statement, we want to push to the login route, and we want to create a new action which will clear our user from the global state. To do that, we'll create a new action. We'll go to types first. We know we need to create a type for each action. We'll create a type for clear user, set to the string clear user. Create a function of the same name within the index file of our actions folder. And clear user won't take any arguments. All it will do is it'll just return an object with the type of action types dot clear user, referencing our clear user type. Then we'll head to our reducers, go to our user reducer. We'll set up a new case for action types dot clear user, where we want to return the initial user state where our current user is set to null. To do that, to spread all of the properties from our initial user state, we can just write this spread operator dot 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 initial user state and set loading to false. So we're seeing the loading spinner because we're not setting the loading to false. So now that we're calling clear user, we can execute it on our props object if we bring it in from our actions folder and reference it within map dispatch to props within our connect. If we save that, we head back to our app and refresh, we should now be able to see our login page. If we take a look at our Redux DevTools, you can see that our clear user action was executed where it just set loading to false and current user is null. If we log in again, hit submit, our set user action sets our user data in state. We can log out or sign out by clicking on sign out. We're redirected to login. Our current user data is set to null, and if we try going to the app component, we're pushed back automatically to the login page. If we want to display some user information within our dropdown in our user panel component, in particular the username, the user that's currently signed in, and to do that, one approach would be to bring in Redux, in particular to use the connect function. So we could grab connect from React Redux, and at the bottom, at our export, can wrap the user panel component with it. Can also map state to props by creating the map state to props function, where we take in the global state and return an object with the properties that we want from it. So for example, we could grab the current user property when we set our user from the user property. So we could create a prop on our props object of current user with the value of state.user.currentUser, and optionally we could destructure the state parameter, so that we could just change the path to user.currentUser, but we'll leave it at state. And now that we're mapping this property to our props, we could log it within render, referencing it with this.props.currentUser. And when our component loads, our user panel loads, and we'll refresh the page, you can see we have all of the user data from our global state. So this is one approach to passing state down from our global state to an individual component such as user panel. But to get the username value within our dropdown, we can create a state object where we have this user property, and instead of logging the value within render to update the state object, we can't do it from the render function. We need to create a lifecycle method such as component.didMount, And then when we get that user data, we can set the state, and in particular this user property that we created, we can set it to this.props.currentUser, and then using the user property in state, we want to get the username. You can get that from this.state.user.displayName. You can save that, and if we reload, you can see we're getting an error. The error is we can't read the property displayName of null. So it looks like we're trying to get a property off of the user object before it is updated. To change that, we can just set a conditional where we're checking to see that we first have a value for our user property, our user object, and then include the displayName property off of that. So that works. But this is a bit tedious to always set up a conditional for every value that we want off of the state object, or a property off of the state object. So another approach that we could take is to use a lifecycle method like component will receive props, where we take in the props that we're getting and set the state according to that. We could set the user value to nextProps.currentUser. So this will also work, but to do this in every component in order to get the values from our global state, again, requires a lot of code. So we're going to take an alternate approach where we're just going to directly set that user value and state to this.props.currentUser and pass down the current user data a bit differently. We're going to go to app.js, and this is where we're going to use the connect function to map state to props. We're going to import connect from React Redux. So we're going to make sure that we're getting all of the values from state within one component, our app component. So we'll add connect to the bottom, we'll add map state to props, and here we'll just have one map state to props function that will give us an object with all of the values that we need from our state, and then just pass down the values that we need via props. So we'll first grab current user from state.user.currentUser, and we'll add current user as a property first to our side panel, which is where our user panel component lives. So we'll pass down current user, the prop of current user, and we'll destructure the props in our props object for app, like so. We'll pass current user to the current user prop that we created for side panel. Then within side panel, we'll have this current user prop. Within render, we can pluck off that current user prop from this.props, reference that as current user once again, and pass that down to the user panel. So now we're receiving the value for our current user directly within state via props. And now instead of setting up a conditional or using the connect function here, you can just say this.state.user.displayName, to get the username of our currently signed in user, and we can change the trigger in our dropdown to this.state.user.displayName as well. So we'll save all those files. If we head back to our app, we can see immediately we have the name of the user that's currently authenticated in both places in our dropdown. So passing the props, passing the global state down via props instead of using the connect function, only using the connect function in one place within our app component will provide a very convenient way to pass state down to all of the components that will need to access information such as the user data. If we refresh again, we can see that our username is still there. We're now passing our username to our user panel. We also want to pass the avatar that we have in our user data to it. So within our trigger, within the span, we'll change the username path to user.displayname, and we'll destructure the user property from state. And within the span, we'll just put this on multiple lines. We'll put an image component right above the name, and the source for it will be user.photoURL. We'll give it a space property set to right and a prop of avatar as well to make it an avatar image. And we'll bring in the image component from Semantic UI React. And we'll just bring it within our grid row, our entire header. We can save our file. If we take a look at our drop-down now, we should see the avatar that we have for our currently authenticated user. Within our chat, we'll have a number of channels that users will be able to add messages to. We'll add the channels component underneath our user panel component in our side panel. So within the side panel file, we'll add channels underneath the user panel component and add a file for it in the side panel folder. Up at the top of channels, we'll import React from React, and this will be a stateful component. We'll call this class channels. We'll have its render and return, and we'll make sure to export the class at the bottom. Within the return, we're going to include this menu.menu component. Menu.menu will be a child of the main menu component that's within our side panel, and we'll make sure to import menu from Semantic UI React. And on the opening tag, set a style prop with padding bottom set to 2ems, so we'll give it some padding on the bottom. And menu.menu will have a menu item within it. That will contain a span with an icon. So we'll grab that from our import as well. Our icon will have a name of exchange, and on the right hand side of this icon we'll have the text channels. So this will basically be the heading for our channels component. Then underneath the span we'll have a set of parentheses which will include the number of channels that we currently have. So we'll create a state object, add a channels property which will be initialized to an empty array, and we'll destructure the channels property from state within our render. We're going to get the number of channels using the length property. So we'll interpolate channels.length, and to the right hand side of that we'll have an icon. The name for that will be add. Then underneath the menu item we'll eventually show all of our channels which we'll iterate over. So we'll just add a comment there for now. Then back within side panel, we'll import channels from /channels, since it's in the same folder. We'll save both of those files. We'll head back to our app, and now we can see our channels header, the channels text, as well as the number of channels that we have. And in order to space out the title from the number of channels, we can add this set of curly braces and double quotes with a space in between to space out the text from the number of channels. We want users in our app to be able to add new channels by clicking on this add icon. And when they click on this icon, we'll show them a modal which will allow them to provide a name for their channel as well as some details about it. To create a modal component, we'll import it from Semantic UI. This will be our add channel modal. And on the opening tag of our modal, we'll add some props. We'll give it some basic styling with the basic prop. We use the open prop in order to toggle the visibility of our modal. We'll do that using a property in state called modal. It will initially be set to false, and we can destructure it from our state object in our render function. So we'll pass that to open. If we set that to true, we'll be able to see our modal. And we'll have an onClose prop, which will be set to a function called closeModal, where all it will be responsible for doing is setting the modal property within state to false. So again, this will set the open prop to false and hide our modal. We'll add a header to our modal with modal.header, give it the text of add a channel. Then we'll include some content. And in our modal we'll have both the form component and a couple of input components. So we'll add a form, and the form will have a couple of form fields. And these will include our input components. Give it the prop of fluid to take up the full width. I'll have a label attribute for the first one of name of channel, a name attribute of channel name, and an onChange set to this.handleChange. So we want to update the state object according to the name property of the input that a user is typing in. So we'll pass an event to handleChange. We'll set the state, set the property according to event.target.name, and the value of that will be event.target.value. We'll add a state property of channel name and another one of channel details. So we'll have another input with the name of channel details right underneath our first input. So we'll copy the entire form field and paste it in underneath. Set name to channel details, and the label will be about the channel. Underneath the modal content, we'll have this modal actions area. These will include a couple of buttons where we can optionally add a channel or cancel adding a channel. So we'll bring in the button component from Semantic UI. The button will have a color prop of green. We'll have the inverted prop and include an icon with the name of checkmark and the text of add. We can copy this button and paste it in underneath with a color of red, the name of remove, and the text of cancel. And since we're returning two components, our menu component and our modal component, we need to put everything within a single component using react.fragment. This is a good way to group two components or multiple components to return just one component within a file. We can add an onClick on our add icon to open modal. So we'll also have a function called open modal, which will change the modal prop in state to true to show the modal. We can save our channels file, head back to our app. We'll try opening our modal by clicking on the add icon. So it opens our add channel modal. We'll head to our React Dev Tools and search for the channels component. We'll type into our name of channel and about the channel inputs. We can see corresponding properties and state are updated, but our cancel button isn't working. We're going to add an onClick to our cancel button. We'll set that to our close modal function, which will close the modal if we want to cancel adding a channel. So if we refresh our app, we can open the modal and close the modal. We have our users collection in our database. Now we want to create a channels collection for every new channel that a user creates. The collection name will be channels, and it will contain an array of unique IDs for each new channel that's added. And that ID will contain the name of the channel that the user specified, the details about the channel, the unique ID, as well as some meta information about the channel, namely who created the channel. So created by will be an object, and it contains the name of the user that made the channel as well as their avatar. And we can add that to take a look at what our channels collection will look similar to. So our channels collection will be composed of an array of unique IDs, and within them the channel information that a user has created. So back in our app, we'll create a handle submit function which takes an event we call prevent default on this event. We'll set up a conditional to check to see that the form is valid that's being submitted. We'll take the state object, and if it is, if that function returns true, we'll log channel added. So we'll create this validation function isFormValid, and we'll destructure the values that we need from state, channel name, and channel details, the property names corresponding to our two inputs. That'll be updated as the user types in. We want to make sure that there are values for channel name and channel details. And we'll connect our handle submit with an onSubmit handler to the form, as well as to the add button with an onClick. Now I can save this and test it out. We'll try adding a channel and open our console. If we don't have any values in the inputs, click on add, nothing is added. We don't see the log of channel added, but if we type into both inputs, we see the log channel added. So our handle submit works only when we have a valid form. Now we'll replace the log with the function add channel. So we'll create our add channel function. And within add channel, we'll be reaching out to Firebase to create a new channel within the channels collection. So we'll import Firebase from 2 levels up. And we'll create a channels ref in our state object. So once again, it'll be the database module, and we'll create a ref called channels. Within add channel, we'll destructure the channels ref from state. And first we want to create a unique key for each new channel that's added. So we'll create a variable called key. We'll take the channels ref and use the push method and get the key property from calling push, which should give us a unique identifier for every new channel that's added. We'll create a new object called newChannel, where we'll set the ID of it to key, the key variable. The name will be channel name, so we'll destructure that from state. And we'll also destructure channel details for our details property. Then we have our created by object, which includes the user name as well as the avatar of the user that created this channel. So to get this information, we need to pass the current user prop and current user information from our side panel down to our channels. So pass that down as current user and receive that in our state with the property name user set to this.props.currentUser. We'll also destructure that, then add channel. So now the path to user's name is user.displayname, and for their avatar it's user.photoURL. And finally we'll take the channels ref, put a child on it of the key variable, use the update function to pass new channel onto that key. Then we'll include a then, and we'll set the state to clear both the channel name and the channel details from state. You could also make both channel name and channel details controlled inputs if you'd like. Then we'll close the modal and we'll log channel added at the end. We'll catch any errors with a simple console error. Now that we've got all that, we can save both files. We can test this out. So let's try adding a new channel. Let's call this, say, food. Say it's a channel about food. And try adding it. So we click add. Looks like we get our log of channel added. Seems like it was successful. And back in our database we have our channels collection, our unique identifier for our one channel that was added, as well as all the information we specified: name, ID, details, and our created by object. We have our first channel added to our channels collection. Now we want to get all of the channel data, all of the channels that users have added within our channels component. We'll do that by creating the component did mount lifecycle method and putting within it a function called add listeners. So we'll execute add listeners when the component mounts. And add listeners will first take an array, an empty array called loaded channels. It's going to add a listener. It's going to listen for each new child added to the channels ref. So we'll take channels ref from state, use the on method, and listen for every new child added. We're able to get information about each child with the snap callback, and we'll push the value of each snap onto the loaded channels array. And for now, we'll log loaded channels when all of those values are pushed onto the array to see what it looks like. So back in our app, we'll reload the page, take a look at our console. You'll see that we have only one value in this array for now, our one channel. If we add a new channel, then click on add, you can see we immediately get information about that new child that was added, that new piece of data that was added to our channels ref. So we'll remove the log and instead set the state. I want to set the channels part of state, a channels property on state, to loaded channels. Then down at the bottom, at the closing tag of our menu component, we want to iterate over the channels that we're getting with a function called display channels. And we'll destructure channels from state within our render. And display channels will take all the channels that we have in state, and it'll check to make sure that the length of it is greater than 0 to ensure that we actually have some. And if that's the case, we're going to map over those channels, and we'll call each element channel, and we'll put them within a menu item, the channel data that we're getting. And on this menu item, we'll set a key, since we're iterating over it, to channel ID, add an onClick, which for now will just be an inline arrow function where we'll log all the channel data. We'll give it a name, set to channel.name, and the style with the opacity set to 0.7. Within the menu item, within the tags, give it a hash mark and then interpolate the channel name with channel.name. We'll save that. Take a look in our browser and we can see we have our two channels appearing here. And when we click on them, we get all of the related channel data. When we click on a channel, we log the information about it. But ideally we want to click on a channel and put the channel information on global state, on its own property and state. To do so, we'll first create a new function called changeChannel. We'll accept the channel that we're clicking on, and we want to fire an action when we call this function with the name setCurrentChannel, which takes the channel data and puts the channel data on global state. So we'll replace the console log within our display channels function with changeChannel, and we'll create this action where we're setting the current channel in our Redux state. So we'll first head to the types file in our actions folder, and first we created some user action types. Now we're going to create a set of channel action types. So our first channel action type will be given the same name of setCurrentChannel, and within our index, once again separate our user actions from our channel actions, since we'll be interacting with a different part of our global state. So we'll export a function called setCurrentChannel. We'll accept channel data, and it'll return an object with a type from action types of setCurrentChannel. Our payload will consist of a property called currentChannel, where we'll put the channel data on it. So within our reducers, we're going to create a new reducer. Instead of this user reducer, which put information on the user property of state, we're going to create a channel reducer for our channel data alone. We'll take the state and the action, and we'll set up some initial state. So we'll call this object initial channel state. Our initial channel state will consist of a current channel property set to null, so we'll have no channel selected initially, and we'll set our state as the default value. The initial channel is the default value of our state. We'll set up a switch statement. We're switching based on the type of the action, and in the case that we have the setCurrentChannel action type, we'll return an object in which we spread all the initial values of the state and only change the current channel property of it according to action.payload.currentChannel with the channel data that's coming in. I made one small error with the clear user case. We want to spread the state and not the initial user state. And in the default case for our channel reducer, we want to just return the state if we don't have a match for any case. We'll put the results of the channel reducer within combined reducers to a new property, channel. So all of our channel data will exist on this channel property of global state, and back within channels we can use our setCurrentChannel action. We just need to import the connect function from React Redux up at the top, then import the action that we want to use, setCurrentChannel. And since we're importing that up at the top, we also need to add connect and wrap our component with it. We'll set map state to props to null, and we'll destructure our action from map dispatch to props. So we'll save all of our files, and back in our app, if we take a look at our Redux state, take a look at our state object, you see that we have this new channel property with a subproperty of current channel set to null. And if we click on the channel, you can see that it's populated with our channel data. So we're putting our channel data now on global state. If we select the other channel that we have, we can see we get its channel data as well. So we're able to switch between channels and alternatively put the respective channel data on global state. We're now able to put the channel in global state when we click on it, but when we load the page, we're only calling the set user action. We're not putting any channel in our global state when our page loads. We have to actually click on it first. So we want to change this behavior. We want to load a channel by default when our page loads. So to create this, we begin by going to our add listeners function, and where we're setting the state, we're adding the loaded channels to our channels property on state. We're going to add a callback function. We're going to execute a function that we'll create called setFirstChannel. And setFirstChannel will do just that. It'll take the first channel in our array, our channels array, and put it on global state. So we'll set a conditional to say if first load, so we'll put a first load property in state, set initially to true. Say if this.state.firstLoad and this.state.channels.length is greater than 0 if it's our first time loading the page, and if we have more than no channels, we have a channel, we're going to call our set current channel action and pass in the first channel. And how do we get this first channel? We'll just take the channels array from this.state.channels and grab the first element and set that equal to the variable first channel. And then upon doing that, we want to set the state in order to set first load to false. We can save that, head back to our app. You can see now set user and set current channel are being called when our page loads. So now we have our first channel within state, and we can still change our channel to another one. However, we're not displaying which channel is currently active, so we want to change this as well. We want to display to our user which channel has been selected. So within change channel, we're going to execute a function which is going to take the channel we're passing to change channel in order to set the active channel. So we're going to call this function set active channel. We'll simply take the channel data for the channel that's being switched to and set the state and update a property on state called active channel. It'll just take the ID of it. We need to create this active channel property. We'll set it to an empty string initially. And then back where we're iterating over our channels with display channels, we'll add this active prop to our menu item to compare if the channel that's currently being iterated over, if its ID is equal to this.state.activeChannel, and if it is, it'll provide an active class to it and highlight it. So if we head back to our app, when our page loads, when we click on a channel, you'll see that we have some indication of where we're currently at, which channel we're on. However, we're not displaying it for the first channel that we land on. So if we want to change that, if we want to show that the first channel is active, when we're calling set first channel, we can call set active channel here as well and pass in first channel. And with that, we're now setting the channel by default when our page loads, and we're displaying the channel that's currently active. Let's now move on to building out our color panel and messages components. We'll start with the color panel, which is on the left-hand side of our side panel. And within it we'll import a number of things from Semantic UI React. We'll grab the sidebar, menu, divider, and button components. So the main component will be a sidebar. We want to use the as prop to make it as the menu component that we imported. And we'll have additional props of icon set to labeled, as well as inverted, vertical, visible, a width of very thin, and within the sidebar, we'll first have a divider to divide it from a button underneath with an icon of add, have a size of small, and its color will be blue. You can save all that, take a look at it in our app. You can see our thin black color panel on the side with our one blue button. Now moving on to messages, we'll import from Semantic UI segment and comment. And we'll replace the starting div with first a fragment. We're going to group a number of custom components together within this fragment, the first of which will be a messages header component. Then we'll have our segment with a comment.group within it, which is where we'll eventually put our messages. And we'll give it a class name of messages, this comment group. Then underneath the segment, we'll have another custom component of message form. So first we'll create the file for our messages header within the messages folder. So we'll import React at the top, and this will be a stateful component. Give it the class name of messages header. We'll have its render and return, and we'll first make sure to export it at the bottom. Then at the top we'll bring in some components from Semantic UI. We'll grab header, segment, input, and icon. We'll begin with the segment to group related content, and we'll add this clearing prop since we're going to be using a few floats within the segment. This basically works as a clear fix when we float items to one side or another. So header will have a fluid set to true. It'll be as an H2. It'll be floated to the left. And we'll give it a style prop with margin bottom set to 0. And within our header, give it the text of channel, and then to the right hand side we'll have an icon with the name of star outline, and the color for it will initially be black. And we'll wrap the channel and icon in a span, and underneath the span tags we'll have a subheader for our header component, which is where we'll show the number of users for a given channel. For example, 2 users for now. And underneath the header we'll have another header which will be floated to the right, which will have an input, and on that input give it a size of mini. The icon will be search. The name will be search term. And the placeholder for the input will be search messages. So this will be an input to search messages in a given channel, and we'll just add a comment at the top for our first header of channel title, and the second header will be channel search input. So now back in messages we're going to import messages header from the same folder, and now moving on to our message form, create a new file for that in our messages folder, where again we'll import React. This again will be stateful. So class message form extends React.component, render, return, we'll export it. At the top we'll import from Semantic UI segment, button, and input. So we'll begin with the segment again. Give it a class name of message underscore underscore form. Within the segment, I have an input, which is where we'll be adding new messages to a given channel. the prop of fluid, the name of message, style prop with margin bottom set to 0.7 ems, a label which will include a button which will have an icon of add. We'll put the label to the left hand side. The placeholder for the input will be write your message. Then underneath the input we'll have a button group. We'll have a couple of buttons which will have prop of icon and widths of 2. So our first button will have an orange color. The content for it, the text on the button, will be add reply, and the label position will be left for the icon, which will be edit. And then the next button, in addition to being able to add a reply, we're going to have a button that will allow us to upload some media with the color of green, content of upload media. The label position for the icon is right, and the icon is cloud upload. And once again, within messages, we'll import our component of message form from the same folder. We'll save that. Now we can see the basic structure of our messages component. Now, as you notice, things are a bit stacked at the top. We need to add a new section in our app.css file, first for our messages class with a height of 440 pixels, then overflow y of scroll. This will be for our messages area where we can look at all the messages for a given channel. Then we'll have a message form section with message underscore underscore form, the position of fixed and set to important. The bottom for it will be 1em, margin left will be 320 pixels and important as well. The left will be set to 0, right 1em, and z index 200, so it appears in front of everything else. We'll save that. Now we can see our messages area takes up much greater height, and our message form takes up the majority of the remaining width. In our database, we'll have a messages collection for every new message that's added. So our collection will be called messages. It'll have as a child the channel ID that the message is written on, and then that will have a child of the message ID, the unique identifier of the message that's created. And on this ID, we'll have information about the message, namely the content of the message, for example the text hello world, the timestamp, which is when the message was created, as well as a user object, which will contain information about the user that created the message, their ID, their name, and their avatar. And we can add this example collection to take a look at what our messages collection might look like. For each channel ID, we'll have an array of messages that are added, and on the messages collection we'll have an array of channel IDs for all the channels in our app. So we'll delete that, head back to our messages component, and we'll first bring in Firebase. So import Firebase from 2 levels up, and we'll create the messages ref, the ref to put messages on our messages collection. So we'll put that in state as firebase.database.ref with the string of messages. And we want to pass this down to our message form via props. So we'll create a messages ref prop and use the render function to destructure our messages ref property from state and pass that down. And the reason for this is that we'll be creating our messages within the message form. So first, within message form, we'll also create a state object which will hold the message. So we'll have a property name of message set to an empty string for now, and we'll create an onChange on the input to update that message property connected to handle change, and this handle change function will take the event, set the state according to the name of the input, and give the corresponding property within state its value, the value that's typed into the input. And on the button, on our add reply button, we're going to add an on-click handler connected to a send message function. So we'll create send message, and we'll first destructure from props our messages ref, which we need to use in order to create a message in our database. We'll check to see if there's a message, and only then will we send the message. So we'll destructure from state our message property, which holds the content of our message, and if there's a message, we'll take the messages ref, and actually before using that, we'll set the state. We'll set a loading property on state to true, so we'll add loading in our state. We'll initialize it to false. We'll take the messages ref. We know we need to provide the channel ID as a child to specify which channel we're adding this message to. So to get that information, we need to go back to our app file and pass it down to our messages component. So we'll use map state to props to get our current channel from state.channel.currentChannel, and we'll destructure it in our props object for app and pass it down as a prop to messages with the same name. But additionally, it's important to note that when we're passing props in multiple components, we need to provide a unique identifier, a key. So to give our component a key for it to be rendered properly, we'll give it the current channel ID. So we'll say if there's a current channel, we'll give our messages component the key of current channel.id, and we'll do something similar for our side panel. We'll give it a key value according to the current user value that we're passing in its unique identifier. That's an important step in passing down props this way. And now, since we're passing down our current channel prop to our messages component, we can receive it in our state object as channel. We'll destructure channel from state in render and pass that down to message form as current channel once again. And then within its state, we can optionally receive it as channel from this.props.currentChannel. And now we can destructure within send message channel from state and provide the child channel ID to get the channel that we're on, the ID of the channel we're on. We'll push that onto the messages ref, then we'll set a given message onto it. But how do we get that message? Well, we'll execute a function called createMessage to do the work for us. We'll create message above our send message function. This will create an object set to the variable message. We'll first have our content property. We'll get this from the message property in state. And we also need a timestamp. We need the timestamp of when this message was created. We'll get this from the path firebase.database.serverValue.timestamp. So this is going to be received from Firebase when our new message is added. So we need to import Firebase from 2 levels up again in order to get that. Then we'll have our user object, and it'll contain 3 properties, an ID. So we need to also pass in our current user to our messages component via props, and then within messages receive that in our state as the user property, and destructure it and pass it down again to our message form as the prop current user. So we'll add user in our message form state as well. This.props.current user. And then down within our user object, we'll set the ID to this.state.user.uid. The name will be this.state.user.displayName. And the avatar, this.state.user.photoURL, to get all that user information about who created the message. Then we're going to return the message and pass it to our set method. And then we're going to add on a then statement. We'll set the state. We'll set loading to false. We'll set the message to an empty string. We also want to set an errors property to an empty array. So we want to track our errors, any errors that might take place in executing this. So we'll add an errors property to state. We'll add a catch at the very end, where we'll console error, our error message if we have one, and we'll set the state. We'll set the first loading property of state to false once this is resolved. We'll set errors to this.state.errors and concatenate our error object onto it. Otherwise, now that just handled the if condition. If we do have a message, if we don't have a message, we're going to set the state. We're going to add an error to our errors array. We're going to concatenate an object with a message property of add a message. And on our input, we can show this error via the class name again. We'll destructure from state within render the errors object, the errors array I should say. And we'll use the sum array method. So if one of the elements in the errors array includes the text of message, just like we supplied in our error message in our else case, if error.message includes the text message, we're going to show the error class. Otherwise, we'll show nothing. So now, if we save all that, we open our console, and we head to our React DevTools. We go to our message form and take a look at our state. Looks like we're receiving our user and our channel, so we have values for both of those. So we can hit add reply. We get our error added to our errors array and state, and we see our red outline. Now let's try adding a message of hello world. We see after adding it, our message was set to an empty string within state, and we now have a messages collection in our database with one message with the content of hello world, as well as all of our user information and our timestamp for when it was created. We added our first message to our messages collection in our database, but we didn't clear the text in our input upon adding it. So to clear that value whenever we add a new message, we'll make our input in our messages form a controlled input. We'll pass down the value from our message property that's being updated to our input component with the value prop. We'll also disable our button upon adding a new message by setting the disabled prop to the loading value. So if loading set to true, it'll disable our button while our message is being added. So we'll destructure loading from state as well. So now when we clear our message property in state upon adding the message, we'll also clear the text that's within the input as well. So now when we add our reply, the text in the input's cleared, our button is disabled for a split second upon adding the reply, and we have another new message within our database. We've added some messages to our messages collection. Now we want to display those in our app for a given channel. So within the messages component, we'll set up our component.mount lifecycle method. So when our component mounts, we'll first check to see that we have a value in our global state for the current channel and current user, and we can get those values from our state object as channel and user. So we'll destructure those. If there's a channel as well as a user, we'll execute a listeners function called add listeners and pass down the channel ID for the current channel that we're on. So within add listeners, we'll have our channel ID parameter, and as the name suggests, we'll eventually have a number of listeners within this function. Our first listener will be the add message listener, and we'll pass our channel ID to that function as well. Within add message listener, we're going to listen for any new messages added for a given channel, first by creating an array called loaded messages, which will be empty. Then we'll take our messages ref and select the child according to its channel ID and listen for a new child to be added, and then we'll get the snap and add the snap value to our loaded messages array via the push method, and for now we'll log our loaded messages array within the console. So if we take a look at our console, on the first channel you can see we have our two messages for that given channel ID. And once again, we want to put these messages within state using setState. So first we'll set messages, the messages property, to loaded messages, and we'll also have a property called messages loading set to false. So we'll keep track of when our messages are loaded as well. So we'll add both of those to our state, messages and messages loading, and it'll be set to true by default. Only when we set up our add message listener will messages loading be changed to false. Then we'll destructure messages within render and now iterate over it with a new function called display messages and pass our messages array to it. So above the render, we'll create display messages. We'll take in that messages array. We'll first check to see that the length of that array is greater than 0, so we actually have some values for it. And in that case, we will iterate over the messages array using the map method. And for each message, we will output the message via this message component, which we'll create in our messages folder. So message.js, we will import React up at the top, and this will be a stateless functional component. So const message, and then we'll export message at the bottom, and we'll first import that in our messages file. And we're going to pass down a number of props to our newly created message component. So the first thing that we need to add is our key, since we're iterating over this. Give it unique identifier of message.timestamp. We'll pass down the entire message object that we're getting as this message prop. And we'll also pass down the user, the current user, from our state object with this.state.user. And then within message, we'll build out our message component. We'll grab the comment component from semantic UI, and this will be the parent component in our message. Then we'll destructure the message and user props from the props object. And the first thing within this comment that we'll include is the avatar of the user that created the message. we'll give it a source, this comment.avatar component, a source of message.user.avatar. And underneath the avatar we'll have the content of the message, the text of the message. So we'll put that within comment.content, but first we want to give it a class name that's conditionally determined based on a function called isOwnMessage, which will take the message and user props. So we'll create this isOwnMessage outside of our message component. And isOwnMessage will determine whether the ID of the user that's currently authenticated is the same as the ID of the user that created the message, and give our message component a special class in that case, just to see visually that we wrote the comment, or the person that's currently authenticated wrote the comment. So if those two IDs are the same, we'll give it a class of message self, otherwise no class. Within the comment content, we'll include the comment author, the message author, make it as an A tag, and interpolate message.user.name to get the creator of the message. And we'll include some comment metadata, namely we want to show the date or the time that it was created. Once again, we'll create another function which we'll call time from now. It'll take the message timestamp when the message was created and convert it into a time from the current moment. So we're going to use the date and time formatting library moment in order to format this timestamp, in order to give us a period of time has passed since the comment was created. So we'll pass in timestamp to the moment function, and then we'll call the fromNow method on it. So that'll give us the amount of time that's elapsed since the comment was created. And then underneath the time, I'm going to include the text of the message content, the text itself. So now we need to create this message self class within our app.css file, create a separate section for our message component. And message self consists of a border left of 2 pixels solid orange and a padding left of 8 pixels. So it'll just be a vertical line next to every comment that's our message. So as you can see, our 2 messages for our first channel, for our food channel, are now appearing in our messages section. We're now able to add messages to a channel and see them displayed almost instantly within our messages section. We can switch to another channel and keep our messages within their respective channels. But now let's move on to our upload media button. We want users to be able to add images to their channels. And we'll do that within our message form component. We want to create a modal property set initially to false. We'll be using a modal just like we did with our add channel modal, our channels component. So we'll create a function called openModal, which will set the modal property in state to true to make it visible, our modal for adding a new media file. And we'll connect this function to an onClick handler on our upload media button. And to display our modal, we'll put it within a custom component called FileModal. And we want to pass down to our FileModal first our modal value in state, which will pass as a modal prop. So we'll destructure that from state within render, pass modal down to FileModal, as well as a closeModal function as the prop closeModal. So we can copy and paste our openModal function and modify it to be closeModal, where it will set the modal property of state within message form to false to hide our modal. We'll pass that down. We'll create a new file in our messages folder of FileModal. We'll import React at the top. This will be a stateful component will have its render and return, and we'll export file modal at the end. And we want to grab from semantic UI modal input, button, and icon. We'll start with our modal component, and on it we'll have the basic prop for some basic styling. The visibility will be toggled with the open prop. We'll pass the modal prop that we're getting from our parent component down to it, as well as close modal. So we'll pass modal to open, and on close have a value of close modal function. Then we'll have a header within our modal, the text of select an image file. Then we'll have a content section which will include the input where users can select a file. We'll have the prop of fluid, the label of the file types that they need to include. It'll have the label of file types, JPEG and PNG. The name of it, the name of this input will be file, the type will be file, and underneath the modal content will include some buttons within a modal actions section. So the first button will have a color of green, be inverted so we can see the text. And within the button tags we'll have an icon, the name set to check mark, and the text of send to send our selected file. So we'll copy that button, paste it in underneath, give it a color of red, a name of remove, and a text of cancel to cancel sending a given file. We'll give it an on click of close modal to be able to cancel sending a given file. So back in our message form, we need to import file modal up at the top from /file modal. Now we can save both of those files. If we click on upload media, we can see our file modal, or we can choose a file. We can hit cancel to close the modal. We want users in our app to click on upload media to choose an image file, hit send, and see their image file added to their channel that they're currently on. The first step to doing that within file modal is to create a state object with a file property set initially to null. We'll add an onChange handler to our file input connected to a function called addFile to be able to add the file that a user selected to state. So this addFile function will take an event, and the path to access that file will be event.target.files. This will be an array, so we'll select the first element with the index of 0. And for now, let's log that value. So back in our app, we'll click on Upload Media. We'll choose an image file. We can see that image file in our console. We can see information about it, such as its name, its size, its type, a bunch of information. But instead of logging it, we want this to be added to our file modal state. We'll check to see if there is a value for this file variable. We're going to set the state, in particular the file property, with the value in that variable. Then on our send button, we'll add an on-click handler connected to this send file function that we'll create. So whenever we hit send, we'll execute send file, and within it we'll destructure the file from state. And once again, we'll check to make sure the file property in state isn't empty, and then we'll include a check using this isAuthorized function that takes the file name to see if the file type of the file that the user is trying to upload is authorized. To perform this check, we'll add an authorized property within our state object, which will include an array of file types that we will allow. We'll allow file types of image/JPEG and image/PNG. And with our isAuthorize function, it takes the file name. It's going to use that authorized array that we just created. I'll use the includes_array method to check to see if our file that's been uploaded includes that file type. But in order to assist in determining that file type, we'll import a tool called mime from the package MIME_types. So MIME_type, or MIME, will perform a lookup for us using mime.lookup. We'll look up the content type of the file based on its file name. So this is how we'll check to see if the file that's been attempted to be uploaded is of an authorized type. And if it is, if that returns true, we're going to create this metadata object with a content type property. Once again, we'll use mime.lookup, pass in the file name in order to put the content type of the file that's trying to be uploaded on this metadata object. And we want to pass it to a function called uploadFile, which will take the file itself as well as this metadata object. This uploadFile function is one that we'll create in our message form. So we'll create it in the parent component. So uploadFile will take file and metadata, and for now we'll just log both of those files to see that this function works. And now we need to pass the function down to file modal to be used. And we'll pass this down as the prop upload file. So back in file modal, we'll destructure our props within send file. We'll grab the upload file function so we can execute it. Then we want to close our modal, so we'll also grab that from props upon uploading the file. Then we want to clear the file. We want to clear the file and state. So we'll create a function called clearFile. It'll just call setState and set the file property to null. So now we can save everything and give this a shot. We'll open our console and then go to our React DevTools. We'll head to our file modal. We see our state with file and authorized. We'll try selecting an image file. We'll select one I have on my desktop. Looks like the file property was updated in state with this file object. And if we click on send, the modal property is set to false, the modal is removed, and we see in our console both the file that we uploaded and all of its data. It's being logged from our upload file function as well as the metadata object. If we try clicking the send button without any image file selected, we see we don't get anything logged to the console. To upload an image to Firebase and to post that image as a message, we'll head back to our upload file function within message form, where we'll first create a path to upload variable, which will reference the channel ID within state. Then we'll create a ref variable, which will reference our messages ref from props. Then we'll create this file path variable, which will use template literals. In the beginning of the path will be chat/public. Then after the next slash, we'll use a function called uuid v4 from uuid/v4 to create a random string. So we'll interpolate that and call uuid v4 and end the path with .jpeg. Then we're going to set state. We want to set the upload state to the string uploading as our file is being uploaded. as well as this upload task property. Let's first create both of these properties within state. Upload state will be set to an empty string initially, and upload task will be set to null. We'll also have a storage ref, and this is the way that we'll reach out to Firebase in order to store our image. This will reference the storage module, and we'll just have an empty ref for now. So for upload task, we're going to reference our storage ref and put a new child onto it, and the child will be the file path variable that we created, and we're going to put both the file and metadata that we're getting within the function on that child. So this is what's going to be stored in upload task, and now within the callback, once our state is set for upload task, we can listen for state changed, and this will have a snap callback, and in this callback we'll create this %uploaded variable, which will store the number of bytes transferred in our upload with snap.bytes transferred. We'll divide it by the number of total bytes, and then to get the % of the file that's been uploaded, we'll multiply bytes transferred divided by total bytes by 100. We'll round that amount with math.round to get an integer, and then we'll set state so we can track how much of the file has been uploaded over time. We'll create %uploaded within state and set that initially to 0. Now after listening for state change, we're going to include an error callback to catch any errors. We just want to include a console.error, and we'll set our errors array state, have it include this potential error message with concat, and if there's an error, we'll set upload state to error and upload task to null. Now after this state changed, we'll include another callback which will reference a snapshot property on upload task, then a ref property, and we'll execute this get download URL method, which is going to be a promise. It's going to allow us to get the URL of the file that's been uploaded by Firebase, that we uploaded to Firebase storage. And we want to pass this download URL, the URL of that file, to the send file message function, as well as ref and path to upload. And once again, since this is a promise, we'll catch any errors, and we can paste in all the error handling that we used for our other error callback. So now we need to create this send file message function. We'll take the file URL, the ref variable and path to upload, and on the ref we'll set a child with path to upload. We'll push that on to the ref, and then we'll set the result of the function create message, which will take the file URL. So now we need to, in order to post our message, create the message with the file URL that's been returned. Within create message, we'll first delete the content property and add file URL as a parameter with a default value of null. So now we'll have messages both with content and with image properties, so we need to determine which is which by setting a conditional where if there is a file URL passed to create message, we're going to set an image property on our message object equal to file URL, which we passed in. Otherwise, we'll have a content property which will be equal to this.state.message. So now back in send file message, we'll include a then. We want to once again set state. We'll set upload state to done after we create and post our message, and we'll catch any errors with console.error, and we'll add this error object to our errors array in state. Since we're creating messages with images on them, we need to display those images. Within our message component, we'll create an isImage function above message, which will take a message and return true if it contains an image property. So right before the closing tag of comment.content, we'll execute isImage, pass in the message, and if the function determines it to be an image message, we'll show an image component with the source set to message.image. We'll set the class name as well to message__image. Otherwise, if it's a message that contains a content property, we'll use our comment.text component, and it'll just display the text with message.content. So within isImage, it's going to take the message, it's going to check to see if it has a property with the name of image and doesn't have a property with the name of content. And now we'll create our message__image class back with an app.css. And this class is just to give the image that we're displaying a little bit of space around it on every side with padding set to 1em. So we'll save that, and we'll make sure finally that we're bringing in the image component from Semantic UI. So we'll test this out by selecting an image file, and when we hit send, it should be uploaded to Firebase storage. We should see our new image message in the channel that we're currently in. So if we head back to our database, we should see a new message in our messages collection, the property of image set to the URL Firebase storage. So if we head to our storage tab, we can see this new chat folder, which we can click on, and within it there'll be a public folder, and within that we should see our uploaded image, which was displayed as a message, where we can see the name, size, the file type, as well as when it was created. Within our upload file function, we have this state changed listener, which listens for the % of the file that was uploaded and set the state with that percentage. It would be nice to represent this upload state using a progress bar. So we'll create a progress bar component to visually show our user how much of the file that they've chosen to upload has been uploaded. So we'll import React up at the top. This will be a stateless component. And at the bottom we'll export our progress bar. And then within message form, we want to put the progress bar underneath the buttons. So first we'll move the file modal underneath the button group and put the progress bar component underneath that. And up at the top we need to import progress bar. Should be in the same folder, the messages folder. And we want to pass to it two values from state. In particular, the upload state, the string that represents where in the upload the image is, and the % uploaded. We'll pass both of those as props. So we'll grab both upload state and % uploaded from our state object. We'll just add this line above the destructuring to make sure my editor doesn't reformat that. We'll pass upload state to the upload state prop and % uploaded to the % uploaded prop. Then within progress bar we can destructure those % props from our object, props object, and we'll conditionally show this progress component based on whether there is some text for the upload state. If it's in the process of uploading, then we'll show a progress component from semantic UI. This progress component will have a number of props. We'll first give it a class name of progress underscore underscore bar. The percent or the width of the progress bar will be determined by our percent uploaded value. It'll be a progress bar. We'll have this indicating prop to give it some additional styles. It'll have a size of medium. We'll give it the inverted prop. So within app.css, let's add a section for progress bar and include our one class of progress bar. We'll have a margin set to 0.3 ems 000 on all other sides and set to important. So we'll save that. Head back to our app. We'll try uploading a file to our first channel. Pick an image file. We'll hit send. You can see our progress bar at the very bottom giving us our upload state, and since we have our image in our first channel, we can see the image was uploaded and therefore the progress bar has a percentage of 100%. There's one small thing to note whenever we add a new image file to a channel. When we upload a file, by choosing it and hitting send, you can see that our progress bar adds to the height of our message form, and it gets in the way of our messages section. In order to change that behavior, the first approach would be to go to the progress bar and only show the progress bar whenever the upload state that we're passing as a prop is set to the text uploading. So as long as the image is being uploaded, we'll show the progress bar, but once it's done, it'll go away. So this is the approach that I'll use. And just to demonstrate this, we'll choose another image, we'll hit send, and the progress bar only sticks around as long as the image was uploading. Now another approach that you can take if you want the progress bar to stick around, and we'll remove that conditional, is to change the class of the messages component or the messages section. So we'll head to our app.css file. We have our messages class here. We'll add another class where if we have our progress bar, we're going to use the class of messages underscore underscore progress, and we'll change the height of our messages, original messages class to 62 view height to give it a responsive height, and the messages progress class will have a height of 58 view height, so a bit smaller. So based on whether there's a progress bar, we're going to use one class or another. We'll do this with a conditional. Check to see if there's a progress bar. We'll use the class messages progress, otherwise we'll use the messages class. We'll create a function within our messages component called isProgressBarVisible. It's going to take the percent of the upload and it's going to check to see if percent's greater than 0, and if so, it's going to set the state of messages, specifically the progress bar property, to true. So we'll create a progress bar property which will tell us if we have a progress bar or not. It will initially be set to false, and then we can pass isProgressBarVisible down as a prop to message form. And within message form, within our state change listener, we'll execute it with this.props.isProgressBarVisible, and we will pass in percent uploaded to that function, and it'll change the state of the parent component of the messages component accordingly. So within the render of messages, we need to destructure the progress bar property so that our class name ternary will work. If we save all of our files and head back to our app, try uploading another media file, we hit send. If you take a look at the messages section, it was pulled up a bit since it has a smaller height, and now there's a space between our messages component and our messages form. Before we touch on our messages header, we first need to disable our upload media button as a media file is being uploaded. So we'll go down to within message form, the upload media button. We'll disable it when upload state is set to the text uploading. So now we're disabling that when our file is being uploaded. Now let's move on to our messages header. We want to dynamically change the name and number of users for the channel that we're currently on within the header. So within messages, we'll first create a function called display channel name. It's going to take in a channel, and with a ternary, we're going to, if there is a channel, within a template literal, display the channel name with channel.name and prepend a hash mark in front of it. Otherwise, if there's no channel, we'll just show an empty string. So we'll pass down the channel name prop to messages header by executing display channel name by passing in the channel that we have within our messages state. Then within messages header, we'll destructure our props within render to grab channel name and then replace our channel text with that value. So we can save both our files. Now we can see the name of our channel up at the top in the header when we click on it. And now we want to show the number of users that we have for a given channel, the number of unique users that we have. So we'll create a function that will execute within our add message listener called count unique users, and we'll pass it the loaded messages, that loaded messages array that we're adding values to. So count unique users will take the messages array. We'll create a variable called unique users, and on this messages array we're going to use the reduce method. It's an array method which allows us to get an accumulated value for a certain type of operation. So the first parameter to it will be the accumulator and then the value of the item that we're iterating over the message. And the initial value of our accumulator will be this empty array that we specify at the very end of reduce. So first, we'll set up a conditional to check to see if the accumulator array includes the value message.user.name. If it doesn't include a certain user's name, then we'll add it to our accumulator with the push method. We'll push message.user.name onto it. So we'll have an array of names within this accumulated array, and then we'll make sure to return it at the end. It's very important. Return the accumulator before the end of reduce. Then we have our unique users array. We'll create a variable called num unique users, the number of unique users. We'll again use a template literal. We'll interpolate the length of the unique users, and then at the end add the text users. So we'll get the number of users, unique users that we have, and then set the local state by creating a property name of num unique users. Give the variable the same name, the property the same name as the variable that we're creating. And we'll initialize that to an empty string. Then we can, within our render, destructure num unique users and pass it to our messages header as a prop. And like with our channel name, we'll grab num unique users from our props object, replace that fixed value that we had with num unique users. We'll save our files, head back to our app, and underneath our name, the name of our channel, we can see the number of unique users who have created messages in a channel. But we can see for this React channel that we have incorrectly 1 users instead of 1 user. So we can detect whether users, the text user, should be plural or not within our count unique users function by creating a variable called plural. It'll check our unique users array, its length, to see if it's greater than 1, or if unique users.length is equal to 0. In that case, we want to add an s. We want users to be plural. So we'll remove the s and set up a ternary. We'll check to see if plural is true. If so, we'll add an s. Otherwise, we'll include an empty string. For example, if we have 1 user, 1 unique user, we're only going to show the text 1 user instead of users plural. Now let's add the ability to search messages for a given channel, where we can type into the search input and get returned to us all the messages that match what we typed in. So on our input, in our messages header, we'll add an onChange and connect it to a function. Now the function that we will connect it to will be within our messages component, since we want to update the state here. So this function will be called handleSearchChange. It'll take the event from the change event, and it'll set the state. It'll set a property on state called searchTerm according to the value that's typed in with event.target.value. So we need to create searchTerm within our messages state. We'll also create a property called searchLoading, which will initially be set to false. We also want to track when this search operation is being performed with searchLoading. So when we're setting the state, or setting the value of our search term, we'll set searchLoading to true. Then we need to pass down the function to our messages header. We'll pass it as the prop handleSearchChange. Then within messages header, we'll grab it from our props and attach it to our onChange. So now when we type into the input, we're updating the state, the messages state. But now we need to filter the messages that we have within our messages state. So we'll add a callback function. When our search term is updated upon calling setState, we'll execute a function called handleSearchMessages, which will do that filtering operation for us. So we'll create this function right underneath handleSearchChange. The first thing we need to do is copy the messages array that we have in state using the spread operator. So we'll spread all the values of this.state.messages and assign it to an array called channel messages to make sure that we don't mutate the original messages array. We'll create a regex using the regex constructor. We'll do that first by providing a pattern which will set dynamically with the search term value from this.state.searchTerm, and then we'll provide a flag, and this will indicate that we want our regex to be applied both globally and case insensitively, so to the entire string that we're matching with the regex, as well as making sure that the case of the text doesn't matter. We'll create a search results array. We'll take channel messages, use reduce to go through the entire channel messages array, and we'll have our accumulator initially set to an empty array, and each of the values that we'll iterate over will be called message. And to add new values to this array, we'll check to see if message.content.match, we'll use the match method to apply our regex to the content of the message. If we have a match with our regex on the content of the message, we will push the entire message onto our accumulator, onto our array. Now it's possible that our message might include an image instead of a content property, so we need to first check that a given message has the content property. And if that's the case, at the very end of reduce, we'll return the accumulator. Then once we have our search results, we'll set the state, we'll set a search results property on state. So we'll create that. We'll make search results an empty array. And now in our return, we need to set up a conditional, a ternary, to check to see that we have a search term. So we'll check to see if we have a search term. If so, we're going to use display messages and pass it the search results array. Otherwise, we'll execute display messages but just pass it the entire messages array. So we'll destructure both search term and search results for this ternary. Now we can save both files and test this out. If in our search we type in the letter H, you can see we're matching all of the messages that contain the letter H. I can type in hi, now I only get the messages with the text hi. And if I type in a capital H, we get the same matches. So again, this regex that's being applied is case insensitive, and it's matching the entire content string. But we can't search for users. We can't search for the messages that an individual user has created. So to add that ability, let's go back to our handle search messages function and add this OR conditional to apply our regex to message.user.name. So apply that to the name of the user that created a given message. So if we save that, now we can search for a user like Bethany and get all that user's messages, or Thomas. You can see we're getting all of their messages including their image messages. And one additional thing we can add, just as a small UI feature, is our search loading property from state. If you recall, we're setting search loading to true when this search operation is taking place. So we'll pass down search loading as a prop to messages header, and we'll receive it first by destructuring it from the props object, then put it on our input component as this loading prop. So when that's set to true, we'll have this little loading icon. It'll be a nice indication of our search operation taking place. So back within our handle search messages, after setting the search results array, we'll set search loading to false, and we'll do this after a period of maybe 1 second. So we'll use a set timeout and pass a value of 1000 milliseconds to it. So now when we type into our search, we get this little loading animation on the right hand side. Just a nice little indication to show our users what's taking place when they type into it. Now let's create the structure for our direct messages component, which will be underneath our channels component. It will allow users to send messages directly to other users. So within side panel, we'll add the component direct messages under channels, and we'll create a file for it in the side panel folder. Up at the top, we'll import React. This will be a stateful component, so we'll call this class direct messages. We'll have its return and render. We'll make sure to export it at the bottom, the export default, and we'll import it within side panel before we forget. And it'll be in the same folder. And our direct messages, the structure of the component will look very similar to how we structured our channels component. We'll import menu and icon from semantic UI, and our main component will be menu.menu with the class name of menu. And it'll contain a menu item, once again with a span, an icon within it, with the name mail, with the text in all caps of direct messages. Then we'll include our curly braces and our quotes with a space in between to space it from our parentheses, which will include the length of the number of channels that we'll have, and we'll designate that with this users property within state. We'll destructure users, then render. So we'll get the number of direct messages channels with users.length. Then underneath the menu item, we'll include a comment. They'll tell us later that's where we'll iterate over the users that we'll be able to send direct messages to. Then back in channels, you'll notice that we had the style prop on the menu where we're setting padding bottom to 2 ems. We'll replace that with the class name of menu, and within app.css we'll create that menu class. So this menu class will be within our side panel, and we'll just give it a rule where we set padding bottom to 2 ems. So now we have the basic structure for our direct messages component. Now let's display the users that we can send direct messages to in our direct messages component. We'll head to direct messages. The first thing we need here is the current user data, which we'll get from the parent component, the side panel. So we'll pass current user down as a prop to direct messages. Once we have the current user data, we'll put it in our state as the user property. When our component mounts, we're going to check to see that we have some user data, that it's not null. If so, we'll call a function called addListeners and pass the user UID to it. So we'll create this addListeners function, which takes the current user UID, and it's going to collect all of the users that aren't the currently authorized authenticated user. We'll first import Firebase from Firebase and add the user's ref to state. So we'll first create an empty array called loaded users. We'll take the user's ref and listen for any new children that are added. And within the snap callback, we'll check to see that the current user UID is not equal to snap.key. This is because we don't want to include within our loaded users array ourselves the currently authenticated user. We'll create a user variable be equal to the value of the snap, and we'll add a couple of properties. The first being the UID property, which will be equal to snap.key, and the status of the user, which will initially be set to offline. Then we'll take each of these user objects, push it onto the loaded users array, then put it within local state with setState onto the users property. Then underneath our users ref, we'll add this connected ref. This is a ref which will give us information about the user's status as to whether they are connected or not. And we'll use this connected ref, which gives us some meta information about each user in our app, to listen for a change in the value. So if there's a value change for a given user with the connected ref, we're going to update a new collection that we'll create in our database called presents. And presents will consist of an array of user IDs and a value of true. So this name and value pair, a user's UID and the value true, will be set only if the user is online, to indicate their presence within the app. So this is how we'll track the user's online status as well as their offline status. So if snap.value equals true, if there is a value change for a given user on the connected ref, we'll first add the presence ref to state, referencing firebase.database.ref with the string of preference. We're going to take the presence ref and we'll add a child to it with the current user UID. And we'll call this value ref and set it to true. So we'll set the value of that to true. And we'll also add this onDisconnect method in the case that if our user disconnects from the app, we'll remove it with the remove method and catch any errors in the process. So now that we're tracking the user's online status with the presence ref, underneath we'll take it and listen for the child added event. So if there's a new child added, a new user is added to our presence ref, that has the value of true, and the UID is not equal to snap.key once again, we're going to add a status to the user. And we'll do that with a function. But we'll first copy this and paste it in right underneath and listen for the child removed event. So we want to listen for when a child is added and a child is removed to the presence ref, and we'll create our add status to user function. This will take a user ID and a connected value, which by default will be set to true. We'll create a variable called updated users, where we'll go through the users array with the reduce method, which has an accumulator, and will iterate over each user value. And we'll check to see if the user UID is equal to user ID, as well as if a connected value, if connected is passed a value of true. If so, we're going to put the status of the user as online. If not, we'll make them offline. Then we'll concatenate each user back onto the accumulator and then set the state. We'll set the users array with the updated users array. Then within the child added event, this conditional that we set up for when a child is added to the presence ref, we'll execute add status to user and pass the snap.key, and when a child is removed, we'll set the connected argument to false, indicating that our user is not connected and that we should give them a status of offline. And finally, within our menu, we'll iterate over the users, we'll map over them, and all the user data will be within the menu item component. The key will be user.uid, set up an onClick, where for now we'll just console log the user data. We'll set the style of the menu item, its opacity to 0.7, and the font style to italic. And within the menu item, we'll have an icon with the name of circle. In this circle, we'll show the status of the user, whether they're online or offline, with a color. So the color will execute this function, is user online. We'll run is user online, and if it returns true, we'll give the icon a color of green, otherwise a color of red to indicate that they're offline. So is user online will take the user, we'll check the user status to see if it's the text online. If it's true, once again we'll have a color of green. Then underneath the icon, we'll just interpolate the username with user.name. So now if we head back to our app and we refresh, in our direct messages we should see another user in our app that's not ourselves, that we can send direct messages to, and on our presence ref we should see one value of true, which is us, the currently authenticated user. When we click on a user to send a direct message to, we want to put the channel information in global state, just like we did for our channels component. but for the time being we're just logging the data for the user that we clicked on. So change where we're console logging the user data and change that with a call to this change channel function, which takes the user data. So we'll create change channel. It takes a user, and we first need to get the channel ID, which we'll store in a variable. It'll be the return value of a function that we'll create called getChannelID, which takes the user UID. So in getChannelID, we're going to compare the user ID that we clicked on with the current user ID. So we'll make the current user ID its own variable, and we'll check to see if the user that we clicked on's ID is less than the authenticated user's ID. If so, we'll use template literals to interpolate the user ID and a /, and then the current user ID to create the path of the channel. Otherwise, we'll put the current user ID first and then the user ID that we clicked on. So this allows us to make a unique channel identifier for every direct messages channel. So now that we have our channel ID, we'll make this channel data object in our change channel function. It will consist of an ID equal to channel ID, a name equal to user.name, and then we will take this channel data and pass it to our setCurrentChannel action, which we have on our props, or at least we will put on our props, first by importing the connect function from React Redux, and then importing setCurrentChannel from our actions folder. Then at the bottom we'll combine both of them. We'll add connect, set null to map state to props, and then we'll destructure setCurrentChannel from map dispatch to props. So now we have setCurrentChannel on our props. We also want to execute another action. We want to put in global state that this is a private channel with the action setPrivateChannel and pass in the value of true. Within types, we'll create a new channel action type called setPrivateChannel, then we'll head to the actions index file. We'll add a new channel action with the same name but in camel case. Now this will take a boolean, which we'll call isPrivateChannel. So we'll return an object with the type of the action from actionTypes.setPrivateChannel, and the payload will be an object with just a property of isPrivateChannel, since the property name and value are the same. Then in our reducers folder in index, we'll add a property to initial channel state, the initial channel state object of isPrivateChannel set to false by default. We'll add a new case for actionTypes.setPrivateChannel, and we'll, in the return, spread the state and set isPrivateChannel, the property, to action.payload.isPrivateChannel. So back in direct messages, we can use this new action. We'll import it and bring it in at the bottom. We'll save all of our files and test this out. We'll go to our Redux DevTools and we'll try clicking on one of our direct messages channels. If we take a look at our channel property, we see our new subproperty of isPrivateChannel set initially to false. We'll click on our one direct message channel. You can see that we called set private channel as well as set current channel. We see our user at the top of the messages header, and that within current channel now the ID is set to this very long path with both of the user IDs. And we're also setting is private channel to true. When we click on a direct messages channel, we're setting is private channel to true within our global state. But if we click on a public channel, we're not changing that back to false. So we want to designate that a public channel that we click on is not a private channel in our global state. So we'll head to our channels component, and within change channel, we'll execute set private channel, pass in a value of false to it, and we'll bring in set private channel from our actions folder and destructure it from map dispatch to props in connect. So we'll save our channels component and first click on a direct messages channel where we set is private channel to true, and then a public channel. Now we're setting it back to false. The next thing we'll do is head back to app.js, where we'll use map state to props to get the current value of is private channel. We need to know whether a given channel that we're in is private in a number of places within our messages component. So we'll grab that value from map state to props, pass it down to our app component. We'll destructure it from the props object and pass that down again using props to our messages component, where we'll receive within the messages state that value as the property private channel. And the first place we'll use it is within our display channel name function. So we want to display private channels differently than public channels. So within the body of this function now, we'll check to see if we're past a channel, and then if so, we'll use a template literal to set up a ternary where we'll check to see if it's a private channel. If so, we'll prefix the channel name with an @ symbol, otherwise a hash mark for a public channel, and we'll add the channel name with channel.name. Otherwise, if it's not a channel, we'll just return an empty string. Then we'll grab the private channel value from state and pass down that value with props once again to our messages header component. We want to use this to conditionally show our star icon. So this star icon will soon be a button which we'll use to star and unstar channels. So we'll set up a conditional surrounding it to check if it's not a private channel. If it is a public channel, only then will we show the star icon. Will users be able to soon star a given channel. Then we'll pass down is private channel with props once again to our message form component, and here we'll use that value to determine the file path where we're uploading a given file. So instead of the file path being chat/public, we'll interpolate and execute a function, a new function called getPath, which will determine which path we should use based on whether the channel that we're in is private or public. So within getPath, if it's a private channel, we're going to return a custom path based on the channel ID. We'll return, once again using template literals, chat/private, and then slash or dash channel ID from the state object. Otherwise, if it's a public channel, we'll just return chat/public. Then back within our messages component, we'll create a new property called private messages ref. We're going to create a new ref which will reference a new collection within our database called private messages. So this is where all of our private messages from private channels will be stored. And we'll create a function within the messages component called getMessagesRef. So this will be important in a couple of cases for determining which ref we should use when sending a message. So we'll destructure a few values from state within this function: messages ref, private messages ref, and private channel. So this will be quite simple. If it's a private channel that we're in, we're going to use the private messages ref. Otherwise, the messages ref. So we'll use this in our add message listener where we're previously using just the messages ref from state. So we'll create a variable called ref where we'll execute get messages ref and change that with messages ref. Then we'll pass that down to our message form via props, and we'll also use it within the upload file function. And this ref variable will now reference this.props.getMessagesRef where we'll execute it. And here within send message, we'll also pluck off from our props object getMessagesRef and use it here in sending off our message. So now let's test out sending both a text message as well as an image message on our direct messages channel for our one user that we have. So it looks like we can send text content, and if we try getting an image file to send as a message, it looks like that's successful too. So our get messages ref and all of the changes that we made in our configuration seem to be working properly. If we head back to our database, we see our private messages collection, or if we drill down, we can see two messages within our one channel, a message with text content and one with image content. If we head to our storage area and click on the chat folder, then we see this private folder with the channel ID. If we drill into that, we can see the one image file that we added. Now, just like in our channels component, we're giving an active class to the active channel that we've selected. We want to do the same with our direct messages so we can see which direct messages channel that we're on. To do so, within our direct messages state, we'll add an active channel property, and then within change channel, we'll update that property depending on the channel that we're changing to, that we're clicking on, by calling set active channel, passing in the user UID, and we'll create set active channel, which takes the user ID and sets the state, sets the active channel property that we just created with the user ID. Then we'll, from our state object, destructure active channel from render and add an active prop to our menu item that we're iterating over, where we'll compare the user UID with the active channel value in state. We'll save that, and if we click on a direct messages channel, now we see a visual indication in our side panel of which direct messages channel that we're on. Now let's work on adding notifications to our public channels. When we're in one channel, let's see that other messages are added to a channel that we're not on. We'll begin by going to our channels component, and we'll first create a property and state called channel initially set to null. We'll also create a messages ref referencing our messages collection, as well as a notifications property set to an empty array. We'll head down to change channel, and with the channel that's being passed in, we're going to set the state and update the channel value. that we just created. We'll execute a new function within our add listeners function that'll take the ID of every channel that's added to the channels ref with snap.key. So this function will be called add notification listener. It'll accept snap.key as channel ID. This will allow us to take the messages ref, put channel ID as a child on it, and listen for any value changes, meaning listen for any new messages added to any of our channels. And if we have a value for that channel property within state that we just created, if the user has changed the channel they're on, we want to show them the number of messages that are new in the other channels that they're not on. By executing this function, handle notifications, it will take the channel ID, the ID of the channel in state, the notifications array in state, and the entire snap. So now in creating this handle notifications function, we'll call these parameters channel ID, the current channel ID, the one stored in state, notifications, and snap. We'll first create this last total variable, set it equal to 0, then we'll iterate over the notifications array that we're getting from state. We'll use find index to do so. We want to find the index value for an array element within the notifications array which has an ID property that's equal to channel ID. So we want to see if we have any information about a given channel. So if we don't, if the index is equal to -1 from find index, we want to push a new array element onto our notifications array. This will be an object which will first contain an ID property set to channel ID, a total value set to snap.numChildren to get the total number of messages for a given channel, last known total with the same value, and a count property set initially to 0 but which will update to get our final total of notifications. So now if we do have an index value for a given channel, we want to make sure it's not equal to the current channel ID, and now we'll update the last total value using the total value from the given array element. Then we'll get the most recent number of messages for a given channel with snap.numChildren subtracted by the last total, and if it's greater than 0, if there is a new message or multiple messages added to a given channel, we're going to update the count property for a given element with snap.numChildren minus last total. So that should be the number of new messages for a given channel. And then at the very end, we'll update the last known total with snap.numChildren. And finally, when the message listener has been executed after firing off a message, when we've run our conditional, we want to update the notifications array in state. So we'll save that, head back to our app, and test this out. First, we need to make sure that we switch to a different channel so that we have a channel value within our state. Remember that our handle notifications function will only run if we have a non-null value for our channel within state by switching to another channel. So we'll navigate to the channels component, then DevTools, take a look at the notifications array, and if we add a new message to this second channel, you can see a new element was added to the array, an object with the properties total, last known total, the ID of the channel, as well as the count. And the count is set to 0 since the current channel ID and the channel ID are the same. We're not going to see any notifications since we're on that same channel and we added the message ourselves. Now when we change the channel that we're on, we want to execute a function called clear notifications. And clear notifications will remove any notifications that we're getting for a channel that we're currently on. If we see that there are new messages and we take a look at those messages, obviously we don't want to be notified about them anymore. So we'll once again take the notifications array, iterate over it using find index method. We'll check to see if there's an ID property whose value is equal to the channel that we have stored in state, its ID value. And if it finds a positive index number for it, if it's not equal to -1, we're going to copy the notifications array in state and set it equal to a variable updated notifications, and we'll use the array spread operator in order to copy that array. So we'll take updated notifications and select an element based on its index, grab its total value of notifications, and we want to update this. We want to update it by taking the notifications array in state, selecting an element based on the index value that we found, and updating it with the last known total value. And then we want to take the count property and set that equal to 0. Then finally we want to set the notifications array in state with our new updated notifications variable. Now that we've done all this work for getting the count of new messages and other channels, we want to display it. So we'll do that within display channels, where we'll execute a function called getNotificationCount. It'll take the channel that's being iterated over, and if the value returned is true or truthy, we're going to display a label component from Semantic UI with the color red, and within it we'll interpolate the number of new messages with getNotificationCount, once again passing in the channel. So we'll make sure to bring in the label component from Semantic UI, and we'll create this new function. So getNotificationCount takes the channel it's being iterated over. We'll create a count variable set initially to 0. We'll take the notifications array in state, and we'll use a for each to iterate over it. So for each notification element, we want to check to see, first of all, if the ID on the element is equal to channel.id. If so, we'll update the count variable with the count property on the notification element. And lastly, we want to check to make sure that the count number is greater than 0. If so, we'll return that number and display that as the number of new messages within this label component next to our channel. So we'll save all that, and optionally, if we want to get notifications about new messages added to other channels without having to first switch the channel, we can, within the setFirstChannel function, set the channel property on state to first channel. Then within my terminal, I'm going to deploy my app with the now CLI to test this out. And once it's been deployed, I'm going to paste the deployed URL that I get into a new tab and bring it to the side so I can log in with a different user and test out our notification functionality. So I'll switch to the React channel, type in a new message. Once I hit add reply, you can see the notification for one new message added to the React channel for my first user. If I type in and add another message, you can see that's updated to 2. And in the dev server, if I add a reply, you can see that a notification is added to the deployed URL. And if we visit both of these channels, we can see that the count of new messages is cleared out when we visit it.